In the summer of 1955, a woman attempted to take her own life in a house not far from Kensington Palace. She was 45 years old. She had spent the previous 5 years waiting for a letter that never arrived, a telephone call that never came, any acknowledgement at all from the two women she had raised from childhood, women who now lived in palaces a short drive away, and behaved, in every measurable way, as though she had never existed. One of those women was Queen Elizabeth II. The other was Princess Margaret. The woman who had tried to die was named Marion Crawford. She had been their governess for 16 years. She had been there the morning after the abdication, when a 10-year-old Elizabeth asked her what would happen now. She had kept the lessons running at Windsor Castle through the Blitz, while the bombs fell on London and the King and Queen refused to leave the city. She had organized the Christmas pantomimes that kept two increasingly restless princesses sane through 5 years of wartime confinement. She had been, in every practical sense that matters, the most consistently present adult in both of their childhoods. She had done all of this without a contract, without a pension, without a single written guarantee of anything. In 1950 she published a book. The book was warm. It showed the royal family as human beings, affectionate parents, funny children, a domestic life that was recognizable beneath the pageantry. It contained no secrets, no scandals, no accusations. It said kind things about people who had given her nothing in writing. For this, the palace destroyed her. The silence that fell in 1950 did not lift. It held for 38 years, through Crawford's financial ruin, through the loss of her home, through her husband's death, through the strokes that took first her capacity to work, and then her capacity to manage the ordinary logistics of living. It held until the 11th of February, 1988, when Marion Crawford died alone in an Aberdeen flat. The royal family said nothing. There is a word for what Crawford did. The palace coined it and used it for decades as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted. To do a Crawfie meant to betray the trust of the people who employed you, to take what you had seen inside the palace walls and sell it. What there is no word for is what the palace did to her. This is the story they never told. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what happened to Marion Crawford, you have to start with who she was before she ever set foot inside a royal household. Because the woman who ended up teaching the Queen of England to read had, at 22 years old, absolutely no intention of doing anything of the sort. She was born in 1909 in a village called Gateshead, in Ayrshire, on Scotland's west coast. It was not a place that produced famous people. It was a place that produced people who worked hard, expected nothing to be handed to them, and held a particular kind of Scottish contempt for waste, wasted time, wasted ability, wasted potential. Her father was a quiet man. Her mother was the organizing intelligence of the household, which means her mother was the one who made sure things actually happened. Marion was the clever child. Not in the performance sense, not the child who raises her hand first and loudest, but in the deeper sense, the child who finds things genuinely interesting, who pays complete attention, who asks the question that makes the teacher stop and think. Scotland in those years took education with a seriousness that was partly religious and partly practical. If you had a good mind, you used it. That was the moral position and also the strategic one, because a good mind was the only asset that nobody could take from you. And for people without money or connections or inherited advantage, it was the one reliable route to a life of your own design. Crawford designed hers carefully. By her early 20s, she had trained at Moray House College of Education in Edinburgh, a serious institution, not a finishing school, not a place for young women to spend a few pleasant years before marriage. She then did further training at the Forgave Educational Institute in London. That second institution is important because it shaped everything about how Crawford thought about children and learning, and it was the thinking that made her extraordinary at her job. Friedrich Froebel was a 19th-century German educator whose ideas were, by the 1930s, at the progressive edge of British educational practice. His argument was essentially this: children do not learn by sitting still and absorbing information delivered at them. They learn through engagement, through experience, through play that is structured enough to teach and free enough to feel like discovery. He believed that emotional development and intellectual development were not separate projects, that a child who was frightened or bored or humiliated was not a child who was learning, regardless of how many facts you pointed at them. He believed the educator's job was to create conditions, not to produce outcomes by force. Crawford believed all of this. She had not trained in it because it was fashionable. She had trained in it because it matched what she had observed about how children actually worked, and she intended to spend her professional life applying it. Specifically, she intended to work with children from deprived communities. There was a serious movement in progressive educational circles at this time. The Macmillan sisters had set up nursery schools in the slums of Deptford. Montessori had developed her methods in the tenements of Rome, and Crawford wanted to be part of it. She wanted to take the most rigorous educational thinking to the children who most needed it and were least likely to receive it. She had a fiancé. She had a future that she had thought about and planned with the methodical intelligence that characterized everything she did. She had not planned on any of what happened next. In 1932, Crawford was working in Scotland for a woman named Lady Rose Leveson Gower. Lady Rose was a sister of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the Duchess of York, wife of the King's second son. Lady Rose needed a temporary governess for her own children, while she found a permanent one. Crawford was available, she was qualified, and she took the job on the clear understanding that it was a stopgap. A month, perhaps 2. The Duchess of York noticed her. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was 31 in 1932, and she was not a woman who missed things. The public knew her as warmth itself, soft, maternal, gracious, the kind of woman who remembered every person she met and made each of them feel briefly like the most interesting person in the room. What the public did not see, because the public was not invited to see it, was the precision underneath the warmth. She knew what she wanted. She knew how to arrange for what she wanted to arrive without appearing to have arranged it. She had been doing this all her adult life, and she was very good at it. She wanted Marion Crawford. Crawford was invited to come to 145 Piccadilly, the Duke and Duchess of York's London townhouse, to meet the children. There were 2 of them. Princess Elizabeth was 6 years old. Princess Margaret Rose was not yet 2. Crawford came. She spent time with them. She was, as she was with children generally, entirely herself, not performing warmth, not adjusting her manner for an aristocratic audience, but simply present and interested in a way that children, who are excellent detectors of insincerity, responded to immediately. She was offered a month at 145 Piccadilly. She accepted. What followed is one of those sequences of events that looks, in retrospect, like a decision, but which at the time was a series of small extensions, each one reasonable in isolation, each one making the next slightly more likely. The month became 2 months, 2 became 3. The permanent governess the Duchess had supposedly been looking for was apparently difficult to find. Crawford kept working. The children were happy with her. The household was happy with her. The Duchess was satisfied in the specific way of someone who has found exactly what she needed and sees no reason to look further. No formal offer was made. No contract was discussed. No terms were laid out about what this arrangement would mean in the long run, what Crawford would receive if it continued for years, what she would be entitled to upon departure. The royal household did not operate that way with positions like this one. Things were understood. Things were implied. The quality of the understanding and the weight of the implication were assumed to be sufficient. They were not. But that discovery was still 16 years away. The house at 145 Piccadilly was a large, comfortable Georgian townhouse. Not a palace in the theatrical sense, nothing like the vast machine of Buckingham Palace that would come later. It had the quality of a wealthy family home, which is what it was. There were staff, there were formal dinners, there were public obligations, but there was also a domestic life that was genuine. The Duke of York, Bertie, as the family called him, was a gentle, quiet man whose stammer had been with him since childhood, and who had built his life specifically around the fact that he was the second son, that he would never be king, that he could have a private life alongside his public one. He liked his garden. He liked his stamp collection. He liked evenings at home with his family in a way that was not performance but preference. Crawford took the measure of this household quickly and accurately. She was good at reading environments, another skill the Froebel training had reinforced. The ability to understand what the people around you actually needed rather than what they were presenting. She understood that the Duke was more complex than his reserve suggested. She understood that the Duchess's warmth was real, and her calculation was equally real, and neither of these things cancelled the other. She understood that the two little girls she was there to educate were completely different from each other in ways that would require completely different approaches. Elizabeth, at 6, had a quality that Crawford would return to repeatedly over the following decade and a half. She was internally consistent. What she said, she meant. What she committed to, she kept. She was watchful and serious in the way of a child who has learned that paying attention is more useful than performing attention, who genuinely listens before she speaks, who notices things and files them, rather than announcing she has noticed them. She was not easy exactly. She expected the same seriousness from the people around her that she brought herself. But she was honest in a way that made working with her straightforward, because you always knew where you stood. Margaret was not yet 2 when Crawford arrived, which meant Crawford's relationship with Margaret was not one of meeting a formed person, but of being present for the formation. Margaret would have no clear memories of a world without Crawford in it. This created a bond that was different in character from what developed with Elizabeth, deeper in some ways, more complicated in others. What was already visible, even in a toddler, was the energy, the performance instinct, the magnetism of a child who has discovered that other people respond to her and finds this discovery delightful. Crawford noted all of it. She was a woman who noticed things and kept what she noticed. In the notebooks she had been keeping since the Piccadilly years began, recording what she observed with the attentiveness of someone who found the world genuinely worth recording. Those notebooks would become, years later, the material for the book that ended everything. She did not know that when she began them. She began them because she was an intelligent woman doing extraordinary work in an extraordinary environment, and writing was how she made sense of what she saw. Meanwhile, the month had become a year, then 2 years, then more. The fiancé wrote. Crawford wrote back, with less frequency than he deserved. The plans for progressive education in deprived communities sat on the shelf of the life she was going to live when the time was right. The Duchess continued to find her indispensable. The children continued to need her. The time was never quite right. What Crawford was losing, through those years of convenient extension, was not dramatic and was not sudden. It was the slow, quiet loss of everything she had intended her life to be. The career, the relationship, the specific future she had designed with care and full intention of inhabiting. What she was gaining was something she had not planned on and could not easily quantify, a position at the center of one of the most consequential families in the world, during years that would turn out to be among the most consequential in British history. Whether the exchange was worth it, Crawford did not know yet. She was young and she was busy, and the work was good, and the children were real, and the days moved quickly in the way that days move when you are doing something that matters. She would have the rest of her life to decide what the exchange had been worth. The answer, when she arrived at it, was not what any of them should have wanted her to find. The first thing you noticed about the Duke of York, if you spent more than a few minutes in the same room as him, was not the stammer, it was the effort. The effort to hold himself together in public, to push through each sentence toward its conclusion, to be present and functional and dutiful in a role that required him to speak when speaking was the thing he found most difficult. The stammer had been with him since childhood. It had been treated, managed, exercised, subjected to various remedies, and it had remained, not constant, not equally severe in every situation, but always there, always a factor, always the thing that stood between Bertie and any room that expected him to address it. Crawford watched him prepare for speeches. This was not a small thing to witness. He would rehearse in private for hours before a significant public engagement, working through the sentences, finding the rhythms that were navigable, identifying the words that his particular stammer snagged on, and finding alternatives. He was meticulous about it. He treated the preparation not as humiliation, but as engineering, as a problem that required a technical solution, and the solution required work, and the work was simply what the situation demanded. She admired him for it. She was careful, in her years at the household, never to make this admiration visible in a way that would embarrass him. He did not want admiration for managing something he believed he should not have needed to manage. He wanted to be treated as a man doing his job, which he was, and Crawford treated him that way. He was, underneath the difficulty, genuinely warm. He found the domestic life at 145 Piccadilly sustaining in the way that quiet people find quiet things sustaining. The evenings at home, the Saturday mornings in the garden, the stamp collection that nobody who didn't understand philately could quite see the point of, but which clearly gave him something the public world could not. He was funny in the dry, underplayed way of someone who has learned not to rely on performance because performance was too costly. He was kind to Crawford in the ordinary daily sense of someone who treats the people around them as people. She observed all of this. She filed it. The notebooks accumulated. The Duchess was a different study. Where the Duke was reserved, she was fluent. Where he found public occasions draining, she found them energizing. Or rather, she performed energy so consistently and so convincingly that the distinction between genuine enthusiasm and its excellent imitation was impossible to make from outside. Crawford was not outside. She was inside, close enough to see the performance from behind, and what she saw was a woman of significant discipline and significant intelligence who had decided, very early, that the role she occupied required the management of appearances above all else, and who had become so practiced at this management that it had become, in most respects, indistinguishable from the real thing. None of this was sinister. The management of appearances is what public life requires, and the Duchess was doing public life at the highest level. What it meant for Crawford, practically, was that she was working for a woman who was always aware of how things looked, who made decisions partly on the basis of what was right and partly on the basis of what was visible, and who did not always distinguish clearly between the two. Regarding the children's education, this produced a specific pattern. Crawford would propose something, a museum visit where the princesses queued with the public, a trip on the Underground, an afternoon at a youth club in a part of London the royal cars never passed through, and the Duchess would receive the proposal with warmth and apparent interest, and then nothing would happen. Not a refusal, a non-arrival. Crawford would raise it again, in a different form or from a different angle, and again the warmth would be genuine and the follow-through would not. She raised the question of the princess's exposure to ordinary life more than any other single issue during her years at 145 Piccadilly. She believed it with the conviction of someone whose educational training had been built entirely on the premise that the environment a child learned in shaped the child, that you could not educate someone for a life they had never glimpsed the outlines of. Elizabeth was going to govern a country. Margaret was going to be a senior member of the institution that governed it. If neither of them had ever stood in a queue, used a bus, seen the inside of a house, like the ones most of their future subjects lived in, then the education Crawford was providing had a gap in it the size of England. The Duchess understood the argument. She was not unintelligent. She simply had a different calculus, one in which the risk of exposure, the security complications, the possibility of something going wrong in a public place, the image implications of a royal child having any kind of incident in view of people who might describe it later, all weighed more heavily than the educational principle Crawford was advancing. Crawford won small victories. She organized a girl guide troupe that brought in girls from outside the palace walls, proper girls, not just household children or aristocratic cousins, but girls from different backgrounds who would interact with Elizabeth and Margaret as fellow guides rather than as subjects or spectators. She arranged swimming at a public club rather than a private pool. She took the princesses on the Underground once, which caused enough behind-the-scenes anxiety to make a second trip effectively impossible, but which gave her the satisfaction of having done it at least once. For everything else, she worked with what she had. What she had was considerable, actually. The curriculum she ran for both girls was more serious than anything the public assumed royal children received. History was her particular territory. She taught it as a chain of consequences rather than a list of events, which meant the children were always being asked not just what happened but why, and not just why but what followed, and not just what followed but whether it had to follow or whether something different had been possible. Elizabeth responded to this with the focused attention of a student who has found the approach that works for her. She would sit with a question, a genuine historical question, not a test question, and think about it with a patience that Crawford found, in a 10-year-old, remarkable. For more advanced constitutional history, Crawford arranged for Henry Martin of Eton to come and teach. Martin was dry and thorough and had the valuable quality of taking Elizabeth seriously as a student rather than as a princess. She was being taught, at 12, 13, 14, things that most of her contemporaries would not encounter until university. Crawford had insisted on this. The instruction was not decorative. It was preparation for a specific life, and if the life was going to demand serious constitutional understanding, then the preparation needed to be serious. Mathematics she taught herself, at a level she pushed consistently above what the household considered standard. Languages she managed with rigor. French was the priority, spoken as well as written, and Crawford drilled it in the way of someone who believes that half learning a language is worse than not learning it at all. Margaret, through all of this, was a different kind of student. She was bright. Crawford was always clear about this, in her notes and later in print, and she meant it. Margaret's intelligence was not Elizabeth's intelligence. Elizabeth's was methodical, thorough, the kind that wanted to understand a thing completely before moving past it. Margaret's was lateral, fast, interested in connections between things, rather than the depth of any one thing. She absorbed quickly, and then grew restless. She retained accurately, and then wanted to do something with what she'd retained, rather than examine it further. This made her genuinely difficult to teach in a conventional sense, and genuinely rewarding when you found the right approach. Crawford found it, through trial and adjustment, and what she later described simply as paying attention. She made things interesting enough that restlessness became less attractive than engagement. She connected what Margaret was supposed to be learning to things Margaret had already decided she cared about, which required knowing what Margaret cared about, which required the kind of attentiveness that most professionals reserve for their most important clients. Margaret was not, in the household hierarchy, the most important client. She was the younger daughter. The educational priority was Elizabeth. Crawford gave Margaret the same quality of attention she gave Elizabeth, which was a professional choice that had nothing to do with hierarchy and everything to do with her conviction that both of these children deserved to be taken seriously. Margaret knew this. She responded to it with the particular loyalty of a child who has experienced the alternative, who understands at some level what it means that this person is actually paying attention. It was the foundation of a relationship that would last 16 years and would then, at a specific moment in 1950, be terminated by Margaret, along with everyone else in the family, without explanation and without any apparent struggle. Crawford's position in the household was one of the stranger aspects of her situation. She was not staff in the below-stairs sense. She ate at the family table. She traveled with the family. She was present at the private occasions that household staff never saw, the informal evenings, the family meals, the moments of domestic life that the public image was constructed to suggest and the reality to obscure. She knew the inside of this world as few people outside the family itself knew it, but she was not family. She was not a friend in the sense that imposed mutual obligation. She was a trusted employee whose trust was total and whose employment was permanent, and whose position sat in the middle of the household hierarchy in a way that had no exact definition. When decisions were made that affected the children's lives, Crawford was informed. She was not consulted. This was not experienced as an insult in those early years. It was simply the structure. Crawford had entered a world with a clear hierarchy, and she occupied her place in it, and the place was comfortable and purposeful, and gave her more than she could have found in most alternatives. What it did not give her, and what she noticed without dwelling on it, during the busy years of the early 1930s, was anything in writing. No contract specifying her terms of employment. No document laying out what she would receive if she stayed 10 years, or 15, or 20. No pension arrangements. No clarity about the grace and favor accommodation that was sometimes mentioned in passing as the kind of thing that was provided for loyal service. Everything operated on the understanding that the household would look after her because the household valued her, and the understanding was unwritten because writing it would have required the household to commit to something, and the household did not commit to things in writing with people in Crawford's position. She accepted this. She was busy. The children were real, the work was good, and back in her private life, or what remained of it, George Buthley was still there. Buthley was the man she should have been marrying. She had known him before she entered royal service, and she had every intention of returning to him when the temporary arrangement ended. The temporary arrangement had not ended. He waited with the patience of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in revising it, which Crawford found both touching and increasingly difficult to justify to him. She wrote. He wrote back. The letters kept arriving on both sides, across the gulf of her royal life, and the gap between what she intended and what was actually happening continued quietly, without drama, to widen. She told herself it would resolve itself when the time was right. The time was approaching the middle of the 1930s and was not yet right. Then, January 1936 arrived, and King George V died, and the time for a great many things became considerably less right than it had been. King George V died at Sandringham on the 20th of January 1936, and the event that his death set in motion was something that nobody inside the royal family had permitted themselves to fully prepare for, because fully preparing for it would have required admitting it was possible. Crawford was at 145 Piccadilly when the news came through. She watched the household absorb it. The Duke of York received it with the stillness of a man who has just understood that a thing he has been trying not to think about is now unavoidable. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something more complicated. Something that looked, to Crawford's eye, like a man recalculating the entire architecture of his life. The king was dead. Edward was king. This was the constitutional fact. This was also, for everyone who knew Edward with any intimacy, the beginning of something they could not quite name yet, but could already feel the shape of. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David Windsor had been Prince of Wales for 26 years. He was 41 years old in January 1936, which meant he had spent his entire adult life in the specific condition of being the heir, celebrated, watched, anticipated, without ever quite being required to be the thing itself. He was the most photographed man in the world. He was charming in person, in the way that certain people are charming, the way that makes you feel, while he is looking at you, that you are the only person in the room, and that he finds you genuinely interesting. The effect wore off quickly when his attention moved elsewhere, but while it was on you, it was considerable. Those who worked with him closely, and Crawford was close enough to the household to hear how he was spoken of by people with no reason to be diplomatic, described a man whose interest in the actual work of the monarchy was inversely proportional to his interest in the status of it. He liked the ceremony. He liked the deference. He liked being the person everyone wanted to speak to. What he did not like, and made very little effort to conceal not liking, was the daily grinding constitutional labor of being the king, the red boxes, the audiences, the careful management of government ministers, the patience required to be the symbolic head of an institution whose function depended on being seen to take everything seriously. None of this was disqualifying on its own. Kings have managed the role with less enthusiasm than it deserved, and the institution has survived. What made Edward's particular version of this quality a different kind of problem was Wallis Simpson. Wallis Simpson was an American from Baltimore who had been married twice before she met Edward, and who had, by 1936, a hold on him that people who witnessed it up close found difficult to describe without sounding as though they were writing fiction. He was not merely in love with her in the ordinary sense. He was organized around her. His moods, his decisions, his capacity to function in any given situation were connected to her presence and her approval in ways that subordinated everything else, including, as it would turn out, the throne. The British public did not fully know about Wallis Simpson in early 1936. The British press had made a collective decision not to report what the American and European newspapers had been writing about for months, which was that the Prince of Wales was conducting an open relationship with a married American woman who was in the process of obtaining her second divorce. The reasoning behind the British press's restraint was a mixture of deference, legal caution, and the genuine belief, held by several editors, that the situation would resolve itself before it became the public's problem. It did not resolve itself. Crawford knew about Wallis Simpson because she was inside the household, and households at that proximity to the center do not maintain information compartments for long. She knew from the way the subject was not discussed in front of the children. She knew from the particular quality of the Duchess's composure when Edward's name came up. the specific stillness of someone managing a strong feeling through the mechanism of not expressing it. She knew from small things, said and unsaid, in the weeks after George V died, and Edward became king, and the thing that had been theoretical became actual. What she understood, watching the household in those weeks, was that the Duchess of York had already reached her conclusions. She did not like Edward. She had not liked Edward for some time. She found his conduct, the circle he moved in, his approach to the institution he now headed, his fundamental unseriousness about the things the monarchy required seriousness about, objectionable in ways she had been too disciplined to express directly and too intelligent to pretend she didn't feel. The news of Wallis Simpson was not a surprise to her. It was a confirmation, and the confirmation hardened something in her that would not soften for the rest of her life. The Duke was harder to read. He processed things internally and slowly, and what he revealed of his internal life came in fragments. A slightly longer pause before answering a question, a particular set of his shoulders in a conversation about Edward, the way he would sometimes stop in the middle of a sentence and look at something in the middle distance for just a moment too long. Crawford had been watching him closely enough for 4 years to read these fragments. What she read was a man absorbing the possibility, which was beginning to feel more like a probability, that his life was about to become something he had specifically arranged his life not to be. Through the spring and summer of 1936, the situation worsened. Edward attempted to introduce Wallis Simpson into official settings. The government resisted. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, had conversations with the king that were reported, in the way palace conversations always were, through the controlled channel of what the household was permitted to know. The Church of England's position on the marriage of divorced persons was not a minor procedural obstacle. It was a constitutional wall. The King of England was the supreme governor of the Church of England. The Church of England did not permit the remarriage of divorced persons. Wallis Simpson had been divorced once and was actively pursuing a second divorce. The arithmetic was plain to anyone who looked at it. Edward looked at it and chose Wallis Simpson. He announced his intention to abdicate in early December. On the 10th of December 1936, he signed the instrument of abdication, surrounded by his 3 brothers in a room at Fort Belvedere. That evening he made his radio broadcast, the voice that had been the sound of glamour and promise for 2 decades, now explaining to the nation that he could not carry out his duties without the support of the woman he loved, framing an act of spectacular constitutional irresponsibility as a love story, and doing it in a voice so controlled and so affecting that millions of people who thought he was wrong wept while acknowledging he was wrong. Then he left. Crawford was at 145 Piccadilly that evening. She was with the children. Elizabeth was 10 years old and had known for several days that something decisive was coming. She did not fully understand the constitutional mechanics, but she understood the emotional weight of what was happening around her, and she understood, with the particular accuracy of a child who has spent her life paying close attention to adults, that the weight was landing most heavily on her father. She asked Crawford what would happen now. Crawford said they would all have to work very hard. It was the honest answer, and the only answer she could give, and Elizabeth absorbed it in the way she absorbed most things Crawford gave her, seriously, without excessive display, with a nod that suggested she understood not just the words, but the weight behind them. She was 10 years old. She had just become heir to the throne of the British Empire, not by any decision of her own, not because of anything she had done or chosen, but because her uncle had decided that his personal happiness was more important than his constitutional function. She did not say anything about this. She nodded and went to find Margaret. Margaret, at 6, understood less precisely, but felt no less. She had the radar of a child who monitors the emotional atmosphere as a survival strategy, and the emotional atmosphere in the household that December was unlike anything she had experienced. The adults were managing something large and doing it imperfectly, which meant the management was visible. She moved through the days that followed in a state of heightened alertness that came out, because Margaret's states almost always came out this way, as energy, accelerated, performative, a little too loud. Crawford let her be loud. Loud was preferable to what loud was covering. The abdication was formally complete when Edward broadcast. The Duke of York, who had gone to bed as a prince and woken as king, was now George VI. his wife was queen. The household at 145 Piccadilly, which had been a comfortable family townhouse for 4 years, was suddenly the private residence of the King and Queen of the United Kingdom, which meant it was temporarily the wrong building. They were going to Buckingham Palace. Crawford had been to Buckingham Palace. She had not lived in it, and the distinction turned out to matter considerably. The palace was not what 145 Piccadilly had been, and not in the ways that were obvious. The sheer physical scale was one thing, corridors long enough that walking from one end to the other required a decision about whether you had time, rooms of a size that made you understand why monarchs historically needed to be people who were comfortable in large spaces. But the scale was almost the least of it. What was different, fundamentally, was the institutional weight. At Piccadilly, the family had been a family with significant public obligations. At Buckingham Palace, they were an institution that also contained a family. The machinery of the crown, the private secretaries, the equerries, the ladies-in-waiting, the household officials of various ranks and functions, the below-stairs operation that kept the building running, all of this surrounded them with a completeness that left very little room for the domestic ordinariness that had made life at Piccadilly genuinely livable. Crawford's position did not change in its formal description. She was still governess. She still ran the lessons, managed the routine, organized the children's days. But the context in which she did all of this had changed in ways she felt immediately and completely. At Piccadilly, her authority within her domain was real and largely uncontested. At the palace, everything was subject to the larger institutional logic, and the larger institutional logic had its own ideas about how things should be done that did not always align with Crawford's ideas about how they should be done. She adapted. Adapting was what she did. She redesigned the routine for the new environment, found the spaces where the lessons could happen without the intrusion of state business, established the rhythms that would keep the children's educational life intact, inside a building that had not been designed with educational life in mind. Elizabeth adapted differently from Margaret, as she adapted to most things differently from Margaret. She had a quality that Crawford found both reassuring and quietly heartbreaking in those first months at the palace. She organized herself around what the situation required. She understood that her father was under enormous pressure. She understood that the institution he now headed made specific demands. She adjusted her own behavior to make those demands slightly less heavy, which in a 10-year-old meant being quieter, more self-contained, less of a drain on the emotional resources of the adults around her. She was managing her parents' situation at 10 years old. Crawford watched this and noted it and said nothing, because what was there to say? Elizabeth was doing what she would do for the rest of her life, managing the institution's requirements first, at whatever cost to herself, without complaint and without visible resentment. Crawford recognized this quality as remarkable, and she recognized it as a form of loss. What was also beginning, during those first months at the palace, was Crawford's growing understanding of something she had not fully grasped at Piccadilly. She had known, intellectually, that the royal family was different from other employers. She had known that the rules of royal service were different from the rules of ordinary employment. She had understood this in the abstract way of someone who has thought about something but not yet experienced its full implications. At Buckingham Palace, she began to experience the full implications. The first implication was this: inside the institution, you were trusted completely and valued genuinely and treated with the warmth appropriate to your position. You were part of a world that was, in its own way, deeply human, full of specific people with specific habits and specific feelings. The kind of world that becomes yours over time, in the way that any world does when you inhabit it long enough. The family was real to Crawford, in the way that the family was real to no one else outside it. She knew the king's anxiety before a speech, and the queen's method of managing difficult conversations, and Elizabeth's habit of rehearsing answers before she gave them, and Margaret's specific laugh that meant she had found something genuinely funny, rather than the performance laugh she gave to be kind. She knew all of this, and because she knew it, and because the knowing was the central fact of her professional life, she had not quite noticed the second implication, which was the one that would eventually matter most. The institution had no provision for what happened to people like her when it was finished with them. The trust was real, the warmth was real, the value was real. None of it was written down, None of it was enforceable. None of it would survive the moment the institution decided that its requirements had changed. Crawford was 36 years old when they moved to Buckingham Palace. She had been at 145 Piccadilly for 4 years. She would be at the palace, in one form or another, for another decade. She spent that decade not fully understanding what she had entered. The coronation of King George VI took place on the 12th of May, 1937, in Westminster Abbey, and Crawford was there. She was there in the capacity that defined her position precisely, close enough to be present, not close enough to be family. She sat where the household seated her, and she watched the ceremony from where the household placed her, and what she watched was, among other things, a man who had spent his adult life specifically avoiding this moment, being required to inhabit it for several hours, in front of cameras and dignitaries and God. The king managed it. He managed it with the controlled, effortful grace that Crawford had watched him apply to every public occasion since 1932, and she understood, watching him, what it cost. The orb, the scepter, the crown lowered onto his head by the archbishop, the ancient words spoken and received. He did all of it correctly, and at no point allowed what it was actually costing him to be visible. This was a form of courage that the television cameras could not quite capture, because cameras capture what is visible, and this particular courage was precisely in what was not visible. Crawford also watched Elizabeth. Elizabeth was 11 years old. She sat in the abbey in her coronet and her white dress, and she watched her father become the King of England, with the complete, unblinking attention of a child who understands she is watching something that directly concerns her own future. She did not fidget. She did not whisper to Margaret beside her. She watched, and Crawford watched her watching, and what she saw in the child's face was not the wide-eyed awe that photographs from that day tend to suggest. It was something quieter and more serious than awe. It was the face of someone making an internal record, filing it, understanding it in terms that would not be fully articulable for years, but were being absorbed now, at 11, in the abbey, while her father said the words. Crawford wrote in her notebook that evening. She knew exactly what she was watching. She knew what it meant for him, and what it would mean for her. She is 11 years old. There was nobody else in that household in a position to make that observation, because there was nobody else in that household who was simultaneously close enough to see Elizabeth clearly, and positioned far enough outside the family to see her with any objectivity. Crawford occupied that specific middle ground. It gave her a particular kind of vision. It also gave her, without her fully realizing it, a particular kind of material. The years between the coronation and the outbreak of war were the years of Elizabeth's formation, in the specific sense, the years during which the person she was going to be became increasingly visible and increasingly fixed. Crawford was the primary witness to this process, and also, to a significant degree, its architect. The constitutional education deepened during these years. Henry Martyn of Eton came regularly now, and his sessions with Elizabeth had moved well past the introductory material. He was teaching her the mechanics of British constitutional government with the thoroughness he would have applied to his most serious Eton pupils, and Elizabeth was receiving it with a concentration that Martyn found, as he told people later, unlike anything he had encountered in a student. She wanted to understand how things actually worked, not the ceremonial surface of it, but the engineering underneath, the way Parliament related to the Crown, and the Crown to the government, and the government to the people. The specific history of how each element had arrived at its current form, and what had been different before. Crawford had insisted on this approach, the teaching of institutions as historical products rather than fixed arrangements, the understanding that things were the way they were because of specific decisions made by specific people in specific circumstances, and that other decisions had been possible. She believed this was the only form of constitutional education worth giving, because a monarch who understood the history of the thing she was heading understood it differently from one who had simply been told how it worked. The difference, Crawford thought, was the difference between someone who could act within the institution and someone who could think about it. Elizabeth could do both by the time she was 13. Crawford knew this the way a teacher knows when a student has genuinely understood something rather than learned to produce correct answers, not from a test, but from the quality of the questions the student asks, the directions in which her thinking moves, the things she notices that she was not told to notice. Margaret, during these years, was receiving the same curriculum and producing the same quality of comprehension and considerably less patience with the process of demonstrating it. She understood what she was taught. She simply did not see why understanding it required sitting still. Crawford managed this through the same combination of creative redirection and fundamental respect for Margaret's intelligence that had worked since Margaret was old enough to have lessons. It was more tiring than teaching Elizabeth, more inventive, more requiring of Crawford's full attention at all times. She found it more interesting, if she was honest with herself. Elizabeth knew how to work toward what was expected of her. Margaret forced Crawford to think about how learning could be arranged so that what was expected became what was wanted. That was a more difficult problem and, for someone with Crawford's training, a more engaging one. Her private life during these years existed at the margins. Pouthlet wrote, Crawford wrote back. He was patient in a way that had long since passed the boundary of ordinary patience and become something more like a settled decision, a man who had concluded what he wanted and organized himself around waiting for it. Not because waiting was easy, but because he had decided the thing being waited for was worth it. Crawford found this both moving and difficult to sustain without guilt. She was, in practice, asking him to put his life on hold while she lived hers inside a household that was not hers and had never formally promised her anything. She told herself this was temporary. The children were growing up. Elizabeth was 11, 12, 13. The Governess era had a visible end point, and when it arrived, Crawford would leave, and she would marry Pouthlet, and she would have the life she had been delaying since 1932. The calculation was reasonable. The calculation kept not quite arriving at its conclusion. What intervened, in 1939, was the same thing that intervened in most people's calculations that year. In the summer of 1939, it was clear to anyone reading the newspapers that a war was coming. The question was not whether, but when, and by late August, it was not much of a question at all. Crawford watched the palace absorb the approach of it in the way the palace absorbed most things, with institutional composure that managed, most of the time, to look like confidence. The king did not want a war. This was not the position of a coward. George VI was not a coward, and his conduct during the war would make that clear beyond any reasonable dispute. It was the position of a man who had lived through the First War closely enough to understand what the Second would cost, and who had watched the diplomatic maneuvering of the preceding years with the specific dread of someone who can see where the direction of travel leads and cannot do enough to change it. The Queen's composure was of a different order. She had a quality in crises that Crawford had observed during the abdication and would observe again now, a capacity to move from the emotional reality of a situation to its practical requirements, with a speed that was either natural or so practiced that it had become indistinguishable from natural. By the time war was declared, she was already, in all the ways that mattered, organizing around it. On the 3rd of September, 1939, Neville Chamberlain broadcast to the nation that Britain was at war with Germany. Crawford was at Balmoral with the children when the broadcast went out. She listened to it, and then she looked at the two girls in the room with her, Elizabeth, 13, serious and still, Margaret, 9, watching Crawford's face to understand what face she should be making, and she understood that the temporary arrangement she had been managing since 1932 had just become something different. The children were going to Windsor. Crawford was going with them. Pouthlet would wait longer. What Crawford did not fully understand, sitting in Balmoral on the 3rd of September 1939, was that she had just entered the final and most consequential chapter of her royal service, that the years at Windsor would be the years that cemented her position as irreplaceable, that deepened her connection to the family to a degree that made the eventual rupture more severe, and that provided, in their particular combination of confinement and significance, the material that the book would eventually draw from most heavily. She was going to Windsor. She was going to manage two young women through a world war. She was going to do it well, and do it without a contract, and do it without any formal guarantee of what waited on the other side. On the other side waited everything that this story ends with, but that was still years away. For now, there was a car to pack, children to manage, a war to survive, and the work of keeping two royal daughters functional and educated inside a castle, while the world outside it was comprehensively destroyed. Crawford was good at work. She got in the car. Windsor Castle is not a comfortable building. This is not immediately obvious from the outside, where it presents itself as the idealized version of what a castle should look like. Towers, battlements, the long sweep of the walls against the Berkshire sky, the round tower at the center that you can see for miles in every direction. From the outside, it is the England that postcards are made of. From the inside, it is a medieval fortress that has been modified continuously for 9 centuries by people with varying ideas about what a residence should offer, with the result that it contains everything a residence might ever need, and most of it in the wrong place. Crawford arrived in the autumn of 1939 and spent the first weeks learning the building, not as a visitor learns it, following the staterooms in the correct order, but as a resident learns it, which means understanding which corridors connect to which, and where the drafts come from, and why the heating in the nursery wing behaves the way it does, and which route between the living quarters and the schoolroom is shortest in the morning when you have 2 children to get to lessons by 9 o'clock. The castle had been modified for war. Blast tape on the windows, blackout curtains throughout. The collection of paintings and valuables that normally filled the staterooms had been removed and stored, the walls bare, the cases empty, the rooms stripped back to their architecture in a way that made them feel even larger and colder than usual. Staff had been reduced. Heating had been rationed in the way that all resources were rationed in wartime Britain, which meant it was adequate in the rooms where it had been decided, adequacy mattered, and insufficient everywhere else. Crawford made the schoolroom warm enough to work in, and got on with it. The routine she established at Windsor was more rigid than anything she had run at Piccadilly or the Palace, and deliberately so. She understood, with the practical intelligence of someone who has managed children through disruption before, that structure was the most effective tool available when the world outside the structure was unpredictable. Lessons started at 9. They ran until 1. Afternoons were physical, riding on the grounds, walking, whatever outdoor activity the weather and the security arrangements permitted. Evenings were organized. The routine did not bend for news from the front or for the anxiety that moved through the castle like weather, arriving and departing without warning and affecting everyone differently. The news from the front was bad for most of the early years. It was bad in the way that the Second World War was bad, cumulatively, progressively, with occasional moments of something that could be framed as a turn, but which felt, from inside them, less like a turn than a temporary reduction in the rate of catastrophe. Crawford followed the reports with the attention of someone who understood that what was happening outside the castle walls was the context for everything happening inside them, and who needed to understand the context to manage its effects on the children. Elizabeth was 13 in September 1939. She was 19 when the war ended in Europe in May 1945. The war was her entire adolescence, which is a statement that contains more than it appears to. The years between 13 and 19 are the years in which a person discovers what they actually are, as distinct from what they have been told they are. The years of formation, in the deepest sense. Elizabeth's formation happened inside a medieval fortress under wartime conditions, cut off from most of the social world that would normally have surrounded a young woman of her age and background, educated by a governess and a rotating cast of tutors, with her parents in London, and the constant low hum of national emergency in the background of everything. Crawford managed this. She is the reason the formation happened as well as it did, and this is not a small claim. Managing the intellectual and emotional development of a future monarch through 5 years of World War, inside a building not designed for the purpose, with limited resources and no clear precedent, while maintaining the patience and the consistency and the genuine interest that the work required. This was Crawford's professional achievement, and it was considerable. What she could not manage, and what she watched with increasing concern through the Middle War years, was Elizabeth's frustration with her own position. Elizabeth understood the war as fully as someone her age, who was paying close attention, could understand it. She read the newspapers. She followed the campaigns, North Africa, then Italy, then the build-up to what everyone understood was coming in northern France. She was aware of the casualty figures. She was aware that young men the age of her cousins, the age of the boys who had been at the various formal events she attended before the war, were dying in significant numbers in circumstances that were occasionally described and more often implied. She wanted to do something, not something symbolic, something concrete, practical, physical, something that used her actual hands and required her actual competence and produced an actual result. She found the position of heir to the throne during a war, which consisted largely of being present and visible and performing continuity at state occasions, deeply insufficient as a contribution to a country that was requiring everything from everyone else. She did not say this loudly. This was Elizabeth. She expressed it in the contained, consistent, quietly persistent way of someone who has decided they want a thing and intends to have it, but has learned that the direct route is rarely the available one. She raised it with Crawford. Crawford raised it with the relevant people. The relevant people said no, then said no again, then said no a third time in different language. The heir to the throne could not be placed in any situation where physical risk was a factor. The heir to the throne's function during the war was to be alive and visible and to represent continuity. Continuity required not driving trucks in military depots where accidents happened. Crawford continued to advocate. She did this not because she thought it was likely to succeed in the short term, but because she believed Elizabeth was right, and Crawford's instinct when she believed someone was right was to keep making the case until the case was either accepted or definitively closed. She made it for the better part of 4 years. In February 1945, Elizabeth was commissioned as a second subaltern in the Auxiliary Territorial Service. She trained as a driver and mechanic. She learned to read a map and change a tire and take apart an engine and put it back together. She did this in Camberley, in overalls, with other women who were there because the army needed drivers and mechanics. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over, and Elizabeth had been an ATS officer for 3 months. The contribution she made in those 3 months was, practically, limited. The symbolism of it was not limited. The heir to the throne in overalls, hands in an engine, taking the same training as women who had no palaces to return to afterward, was an image that meant something in 1945. Crawford had spent 4 years arguing for it. She allowed herself, in the privacy of her own satisfaction, to feel that the 4 years had been well spent. Margaret's wartime experience was entirely different, because Margaret's experience of most things was entirely different. She was 9 years old when the war started, and 15 when it ended. The years of her early adolescence were spent inside Windsor Castle, with a small and fixed social world, limited external stimulation, a sister who was 6 years older and therefore at a different stage of everything, and energy levels that were, in normal circumstances, difficult to contain, and which Windsor's particular combination of confinement and monotony made considerably harder. Crawford managed Margaret's wartime boredom with the creative resourcefulness of someone who has used up the obvious solutions and is now working through the less obvious ones. She redesigned lessons to incorporate more movement. She found ways to connect what Margaret was studying to things Margaret cared about, which required constant recalibration because what Margaret cared about shifted more rapidly than any curriculum could track. She gave Margaret projects, with real outcomes, not busy work. She took Margaret's comedy instincts seriously, as an intelligence rather than as a disruption to be managed. And then, in 1941, she organized the pantomimes. The Windsor pantomimes are one of those historical footnotes that sound trivial, and were not. Crawford organized them. This is documented and was never seriously contested by anyone who knew the household. She arranged for Hubert Tanner, the castle's music director, to write the scripts. She supervised the rehearsals. She managed the production. She coordinated the costumes, the staging, the technical arrangements involved in turning the Waterloo Chamber, a room designed for state banquets, not theatrical productions, into a working performance space for several hundred people. The productions ran every year from 1941 to 1944. The audience was the castle's wartime population, the household staff, the guards, the domestic workers, the small community of people who had been living and working at Windsor through the war. Several hundred people who were cold and tired and far from their own families, who had been managing the particular strain of wartime service in a residential institution, who needed something to look forward to, and then needed something to look back on, with the specific warmth that a shared experience provides. The pantomimes gave them that. They were not amateur in the sense of being half-hearted. They were amateur in the sense of being done by people who were not professional performers, to a standard that would have been respectable from people who were. Crawford made sure of this. She treated the productions as real work, requiring real discipline and real preparation, and the princesses responded accordingly. Elizabeth approached the pantomimes the way she approached most things that required skills she did not naturally possess, with a determination so visible that it became, in itself, part of the appeal. She knew her lines without fail, delivered them with a slight stiffness that the audience found charming rather than awkward, and committed to the physical comedy with a willingness that suggested she had decided that dignity was a reasonable sacrifice for a good cause. The audience at Windsor in 1942, watching Princess Elizabeth fall over a prop and get up and continue without breaking character, was watching someone try very hard at something genuinely difficult, and genuine effort at something difficult is not a small thing to be given. Margaret was the production. She had everything the stage rewards: timing, presence, the actor's specific capacity to exist completely inside a scene rather than observing it from the outside. She could hold an audience's attention while doing nothing because she knew, in the way that some performers simply know, how to make an audience feel that something is about to happen. When something then happened, the payoff was reliable. She also had a relationship with the script that Crawford managed, with the firmness of someone who has dealt with talented but undisciplined performers before. Margaret's view of a finished script was that it was a detailed suggestion. Crawford's view was that it was the thing they had rehearsed and would perform. The negotiation between these positions ran through every production and was resolved, each time, in roughly the same way. Margaret was given enough latitude to feel like herself, and enough structure to keep the production coherent. The audiences loved her. They loved Elizabeth too, but with the warmer, more protective affection reserved for someone you can see trying. They loved Margaret with the simpler, more helpless response of people who have just been made to laugh by someone who knew exactly how to make them laugh. These were different kinds of love, and both were real, and both were, Crawford understood, important. The Windsor pantomimes gave people who had very little to celebrate something to celebrate. They gave the castle's wartime community a set of shared memories that functioned, through the rest of the war and afterward, as evidence that something good had happened there. Crawford had made them happen. Nobody outside the castle knew this, because the pantomimes were not public, and Crawford was not the kind of person who sought credit for things she had organized. The satisfaction she took from them was private and sufficient. She had other satisfactions during the Windsor years that were also private. The relationship between her and Elizabeth had deepened during the war, in ways that proximity and shared difficulty always deepen relationships. Crawford had been there through everything, through the bombing raids that occasionally reached Windsor, through the news of deaths among people the family knew, through the private anxiety of waiting for parents who chose to stay in London while the London bombs fell. She had been the one who was there. That was, in the most basic emotional sense, what mattered. Elizabeth was not demonstrative. She did not express attachment through warmth in the conventional sense. She expressed it through trust, through the particular form of openness she showed with people she had decided were reliable, which was not quite the same as warmth but was, Crawford came to understand, more substantial. Elizabeth trusted Crawford in a way she trusted very few people, and the trust had the quality of something that had been tested and had held. Crawford trusted that this trust would survive her retirement. She was wrong about this, but she did not know that yet. In 1945, the war in Europe ended, and the war in the Pacific ended, and the country spent a summer exhaling after 5 years of something it had not been certain it would survive. Crawford was 35 years old. Buthley was 45. Elizabeth was 19, and becoming, with increasing speed, someone who no longer needed a governess in any formal sense. Margaret was 15. The end of the governess era was approaching. Crawford could see it clearly enough. She had known it was coming for some time. She had the life with Buthley to return to, the private future she had been deferring since 1932. She was ready, or ready enough. She was also, though she would not have framed it this way, more deeply inside this world than she had ever been. The war had done that. 5 years of being the fixed point, the person who kept the routine, organized the pantomimes, managed the girls through adolescence while their parents were largely elsewhere, had created a connection that was different in character from anything that had developed at Piccadilly or the early palace years. Crawford was not naive about what that connection was. She knew it was real. She knew it was valuable. She did not know, and would not know until 1950, that it was also, in the way of things that are unwritten and never contractually guaranteed, entirely conditional. The war ended. Life at Windsor began its slow return to something that was not quite normal, but was moving in that direction. Elizabeth was 19, and beginning the stage of life that did not involve Crawford in its central daily operations. Burleigh was still waiting. Crawford began, finally, to move toward him. George Burleigh had been waiting for 15 years. Not in the dramatic sense. He had not been sitting in a room somewhere staring at the door. He had a career, a life, the ordinary forward motion of a man who has decided what he wants and is patient enough to wait for the conditions that make it possible. But he had been waiting, in the specific sense of having organized his emotional life around a person who was not yet available, for 15 years by the time Crawford finally came to him, in any real sense. They married on the 16th of September, 1947. Crawford was 37. Burleigh was 47. The ceremony was quiet. No grand occasion, no society wedding, nothing that would attract the kind of attention that attached itself to anyone connected to the royal family. The princesses attended. The royal family gave gifts. There was warmth at the occasion, the particular warmth of a household sending off someone it values, and Crawford received it, and was moved by it, and did not, in that moment, think to examine it too closely. She should have examined it more closely. What she was receiving, though nobody said this, and perhaps nobody consciously knew it, was valedictory warmth. The warmth of conclusion. The warmth that institutions extend to people they are finished with, and wish well from a distance. It felt like the warmth of continuity, of a relationship that was changing form but not ending. It was not that. It was the last substantial warmth she would receive from any of them. She did not know this in September 1947. She was 37, and newly married, and moving toward the private life she had been postponing since she was 22. Burleigh was steady and decent, and had waited long enough that his waiting had become, in Crawford's experience of it, the most unambiguous declaration of love she had encountered. A man who waits 15 years has made his position clear. Crawford, who valued clarity above most things, found this deeply reassuring. She officially retired from the royal household in the spring of 1948. The moment of departure was, by the accounts available, genuinely affectionate. Elizabeth was 22. She was a married woman. Philip had come into the picture with increasing formality through the preceding years, the courtship that had begun in letters during the war years and had culminated in their marriage in November 1947. The governess era was over because Elizabeth had arrived at the stage of life for which a governess was no longer the relevant structure. Crawford's departure was not a dismissal. It was a natural conclusion, handled with the care that the household gave to things it wanted handled carefully. She was given a grace and favor residence, a house in the grounds of Kensington Palace, a real property, a proper home, not a set of rooms but a house with a garden, the kind of material provision that represented genuine generosity in the way the royal household understood generosity. It was a significant benefit. Crawford understood it as such. She was grateful for it in the way you are grateful for something substantial. She was also given, in the way the royal household gave things it did not want to put in writing, the assurance that the connection with the family would continue. Not in the daily professional sense. She was retired, the children were adults, the role was done, but as something, as the continued acknowledgement of 16 years, as the kind of warmth that had characterized the household at its best, as letters perhaps, as invitations, as the ongoing membership, in some informal but real form, of a world she had inhabited for 16 years. None of this was written down. This is the fact that everything else pivots on, and it is worth sitting with, because it is so easy to pass over. Nothing in Crawford's arrangement with the royal family was ever written down. Not the terms of her employment, not what she would receive upon retirement. Not the pension arrangements, because there were no pension arrangements. The royal household did not operate a formal pension system for employees of Crawford's category. Not the grace and favor house, in any document that specified how long she would have it, or on what basis it could be reclaimed. Not the assurance of continued connection. None of it. Everything operated on the understanding that the institution was honorable, that people who served it faithfully would be looked after in the manner appropriate to faithful service, that the trust which governed the relationship from Crawford's side was matched by the trust the institution extended from its side. This was the understanding. It was not a contract. It had no enforcement mechanism. It was worth precisely as much as the institution chose, at any given moment, to honor it. Crawford moved into the Kensington Palace house with Buthley and began the private life she had been designing in the background of her professional life since 1932. The house was comfortable. The location was extraordinary. She was living, still, at the edge of the royal world, surrounded by the buildings and the grounds she had known for a decade. It was not, in the material sense, a bad situation. The problem arrived, as practical problems often arrive, not all at once, but in the slow accumulation of ordinary expenses. The house required maintenance. The house required heating. Living in a royal grace and favour property rent-free did not pay for food or coal or medical costs, or the 100 ordinary expenses of daily life. Crawford had been salaried during her years of royal service. The salary had been paid and spent as salaries are spent, on the living of the life. There had been no surplus to accumulate, no fund quietly building toward retirement, no cushion. She had been paid to do a job, and she had done the job, and she had been paid, and that was the accounting. Buthley's income from his banking work was real, but not abundant. He was not a wealthy man. They were not a wealthy couple. They were a middle-aged couple, living in a house they did not own, without a pension, in post-war Britain where the cost of things was rising, and the economic certainty that the pre-war years had sometimes provided was gone. Crawford needed income. She turned this over in her mind with the practical directness that characterized her approach to most problems. She was intelligent, she was literate, she could write, had been writing, in various forms, since before she entered royal service. She was also in possession of something that almost nobody else in England possessed: 16 years of first-hand observation of the royal family during the most consequential period in its modern history. The abdication, the coronation, the war, Elizabeth's formation into the person who would one day be queen. All of it, seen from closer range than any journalist or biographer had ever been permitted, and retained in the precise and attentive memory of a woman who had been noting things since 1932. The market value of this material was not something Crawford had to calculate with any great effort. It was obvious. Publishers would pay substantially for it. Specifically, American publishers would pay substantially for it, because the American appetite for access to the British royal family had been building since the abdication, and had reached, with the romance and marriage of the young Princess Elizabeth, a kind of peak. The Ladies' Home Journal made contact. It was one of the largest circulation magazines in the United States, readership in the millions, the kind of publication that shaped the taste and conversation of middle-class American women in the late 1940s. They were interested in a serialized memoir of Crawford's years with the princesses. They had lawyers who had examined the question of what she was legally permitted to publish. The lawyer's conclusion, in the absence of any written agreement prohibiting publication, was cautious but not prohibitive. Crawford considered the offer carefully. She also, by her own account, raised the question with the royal family before accepting it. She was clear on this point in everything she said about it afterward, and the clarity was consistent. She had not proceeded without attempting to establish whether proceeding was acceptable. She had asked. This is where the accounts diverged sharply, and remain diverged. The palace maintained, then and in all subsequent versions of the story, that Crawford had been explicitly warned not to publish. Crawford maintained that she had received no clear instruction prohibiting it. She had asked and had not been told no in terms that she understood as a direct refusal. Neither account is supported by documentation, because there was no documentation. There was never any documentation of anything in Crawford's relationship with the royal family. The absence of documentation, which had been the structural condition of her service from the beginning, was now doing a different kind of work. It meant that the question of what she had been told could never be settled. Each side had its version. Neither version could be proved. What could be established was this: Crawford was a woman of 56, no, of 38, who had served for 16 years without a contract, who had retired without a pension, who was living in a house she did not own, with income she did not have enough of, and who had been approached by an American publisher willing to pay serious money for a memoir that no written agreement prohibited her from writing. She signed. She signed knowing that the royal family would be displeased. She did not know the displeasure would take the form it took. This is the thing that people who have read the story backward, from the ending toward the beginning, sometimes fail to understand. Crawford was not naive about the risk she was taking. She understood that the household would not welcome the book. What she did not understand, could not have understood without having seen it before, was that the displeasure would be total and permanent and absolute, that the warmth of 37 years would be switched off as cleanly as a light, that Elizabeth and Margaret and the Queen Mother would all, without exception, and apparently without struggle, behave from that point forward as though Marion Crawford had never existed. She understood the household well enough to know it operated by clear rules. She did not understand how ruthlessly the rules would be applied to her specifically, because nobody had applied them to her before. She had been inside, always, for 16 years. She had never been on the wrong side of the mechanism. She did not know what the mechanism looked like from the wrong side.
If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one.
She was about to find out. But first, the book had to be written, and Crawford wrote it with the same methodical care she brought to everything she did, and the book was not what anyone who encountered the response to it would expect it to be. It was not a document of exposure. It was not an act of revenge. It was not a commercial exploitation of private information for maximum sensational effect. It was, if anything, an act of love. Crawford wrote about those two little girls the way you write about people you have spent 16 years watching, with genuine attention and genuine feeling. She wrote about Elizabeth's consistency, the quality of her attention, the way she listened before she spoke. She wrote about Margaret's comedy instinct and her vulnerability and the specific difficulty of her position as the second daughter. She wrote about the Duke's courage with his stammer and the Duchess's social precision and the domestic life at 145 Piccadilly that had been, by any honest standard, warm. She showed the royal family as human. That was the problem, not the specific details, not any particular revelation. The problem was the category, the dissolution of the boundary between the private and the public, the confirmation that behind the official portrait there were people, ordinary and recognizable, and not very different from anyone else, managing the same private difficulties and private joys that everyone managed. The monarchy could not afford to be human in the way Crawford's book made it human. The authority of the institution depended, in significant measure, on a distance that Crawford had closed. She had closed it with affection and good faith, and no apparent understanding that affection and good faith were not defenses against the institutional response. The book was published in 1950. The response arrived immediately. Crawford went home and waited for the letter that would tell her that the family was upset, that the response to the book had created difficulty, that there would need to be a conversation about how things would go from here. She waited for the letter because 16 years of genuine relationship with these people had given her the reasonable expectation that the relationship would survive even a significant disagreement. The letter did not come. No letter came. No call. Nothing. The silence that descended in 1950 was not, Crawford would slowly come to understand, a temporary response to a specific offense. It was not the silence of people who were angry and needed time. It was the silence of an institution that had made a decision and implemented it fully, in every direction, simultaneously, without exception or residual warmth of any kind. It was, in other words, the silence she would spend the rest of her life waiting to end. It did not end. The book itself is worth reading, if you want to understand how completely the punishment exceeded the crime. The Little Princesses is not a scandalous document. It is not the work of someone who has decided to settle scores or extract maximum commercial value from privileged access. It does not contain revelations of the kind that would damage careers or destabilize institutions or provide material for lawyers. What it contains is this: a warm, specific, affectionate account of two children growing up in unusual circumstances, written by the woman who was most responsible for managing that growing up. and who clearly loved both of them. Crawford describes Elizabeth's consistency, the child who meant what she said, kept what she promised, listened before she spoke, fell off her horse, and got back on without drama. She describes Margaret's comedy, the timing, the mimicry, the performing intelligence that could hold a room before it had learned to do anything else. She describes the domestic life at 145 Piccadilly, with the particularity of someone who was actually there. The evenings, the meals, the Saturday mornings when the Duke was in his garden, and the house had the quality of a family house rather than a public institution. She describes the war years at Windsor with the honesty of someone who had managed them from the inside. The routine, the pantomimes, the specific boredom and specific courage of two young women confined in a castle while their country fought for its life. She describes the family as human. That sentence is the whole problem, stated as plainly as it can be stated. The royal family was human. Crawford knew this because she had lived inside their humanity for 16 years. She put it on the page with the directness of someone who considered humanness a compliment rather than an exposure, and the institution she had served received it as the most serious violation imaginable. The mechanism of the modern British monarchy depends on a separation that is, if you examine it directly, somewhat strange. The family must be visible enough to be beloved, and remote enough to be symbolic, present enough to appear dedicated, and elevated enough to appear exceptional. The image that sustains this requires continuous careful management. What is shown, what is withheld, what is framed as dedication, and what is never mentioned at all. The gap between the private reality and the public portrait is not incidental to the institution's function. It is structural. The portrait holds its power specifically because the reality behind it is not available for comparison. Crawford had made the comparison available. She had not intended harm. She had written with love about people she loved, and the love was visible on every page, and it made no difference. The category violation was the thing. You did not write about the inside. You did not dissolve the distance. The distance was not a preference that Crawford had been inconsiderate of. It was a requirement that she had been trusted to maintain permanently and had failed to maintain. The response was organized with a completeness that suggested it had not required much organization, that the decision, when it came, had been made quickly and implemented immediately because the institution knew, without having to deliberate at length, what its response to this situation was. There was a template. Crawford was the first person to whom it had been applied at this scale and with this visibility, but the template existed. Elizabeth made no contact. This is worth saying plainly, because it is the most important fact of the response, and the one Crawford found, by her own subsequent account, the hardest to absorb. Not the Queen Mother's silence. The Queen Mother was the Duchess of York, Crawford's direct employer, the woman who had brought her into the household, and whose response was therefore an employer's response as much as anything else. Not Margaret's silence. Margaret was 20 years old, and living within an institution that had just made very clear what the correct response to Crawford's book was, and Margaret was not, in 1950, in a position to complicate that clarity. Elizabeth's silence was different. Elizabeth had known Crawford since she was 6 years old. Elizabeth had been the child who asked Crawford what would happen now, the night of the abdication, and had nodded when Crawford said they would all have to work very hard. Elizabeth had been the student who engaged with history as consequence rather than date, who listened before she spoke, who Crawford had described, in her notebook, as knowing exactly what she was watching at her father's coronation. Elizabeth had trusted Crawford in the specific way that she trusted very few people, with the full trust of someone who has decided, on the basis of evidence accumulated over time, that the person in front of her is reliable. The trust did not survive the book. Not a word, not an acknowledgement that the book existed, not a private letter expressing displeasure and requesting a conversation. Nothing that treated Crawford as a person with whom Elizabeth had 16 years of genuine history. The silence was total, and it was implemented as efficiently as any other institutional decision Elizabeth made, because by 1950, Elizabeth was no longer only a person, she was also, and increasingly primarily, the future of an institution that had just decided how it felt about Marion Crawford. The Queen Mother's silence had a specific character that Crawford would come to understand over the following years as the most definitively closed of all the doors that closed in 1950. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had a quality of decision that people who knew her well described in different ways, but always arrived at the same essential description. When she decided something, she decided it. She did not revisit, she did not moderate, she did not allow time or new information or the accumulation of evidence to reopen what she had closed. She had decided about Crawford, and the decision was not a matter of ongoing feeling, but of settled position, as fixed and unrevised as anything she had ever settled. The Grace and Favour House at Kensington Palace remained in Crawford's possession for a time after the book appeared. The mechanism of reclaiming such properties is slow and requires administrative process, and the administrative process took time, but the character of the house changed immediately. It had been a gift, a material acknowledgement of valued service, a home provided in recognition of a relationship. It was now a residual benefit from a relationship that had been publicly concluded, occupied by someone the institution had placed outside its walls. Crawford wrote. She wrote to Elizabeth first. Not immediately after the book appeared, she understood that the publication was too fresh for any communication to be productive, that the household's anger needed time to settle before any conversation was possible. She waited. Then she wrote, carefully and honestly, in the way she had always done things, directly, without performance, saying what she meant. No reply came. She wrote to Margaret, she wrote to the Queen Mother. The letters disappeared into the palace machinery without producing any response. Not a refusal, not an acknowledgement of receipt, nothing. This nothingness was, for Crawford, a new kind of experience. She had spent 16 years inside a world where things were communicated through implication and inference, where what was not said was often as important as what was, where the management of information was a practiced institutional art. She understood that form of silence, the silence that managed rather than excluded. This silence was different. This silence did not manage. It excluded. It excluded with a completeness that left no gap through which any residual connection could pass. The phrase entered circulation. Doing a Crawford! It appeared first in royal household circles, among staff and those close enough to the family to hear how the family spoke about the situation internally. From those circles it spread outward, into the aristocratic social world that orbited the monarchy, into the professional world of people who worked adjacent to royal life, eventually into broader use as a piece of cultural shorthand that outlasted the specific circumstances that had produced it. To do a Crawford was to betray the trust of the people who had employed you, to use intimate access for personal gain, to dissolve the boundary that royal service required you to maintain in exchange for money or attention or whatever version of personal advantage the specific Crawford had calculated. The phrase did several things simultaneously. It named what Crawford had done in terms that made the naming its own punishment. She was no longer a person in this framing, but a category of error. It served as a warning to everyone else, in or near royal service, about the cost of a similar decision. It framed the institutional response as proportionate, even inevitable, because the framing made the offense serious enough to warrant the response. What the phrase did not do was examine the offense on its own terms. It did not ask whether a warm book about 2 children, written by the woman who raised them, with no state secrets and no allegations, and nothing that could be honestly described as damaging, warranted the label of betrayal. It did not ask what the institution had provided Crawford in exchange for the silence she had maintained for 16 years. It did not ask about the pension arrangements, the written guarantees, the specific provisions for her welfare after retirement. The phrase closed the question by reframing it, and once the reframing was in circulation, the question stayed closed. Crawford was now outside, not simply retired, outside. The social world she had occupied for 16 years closed against her with the same totality that the correspondence did. The people she had known through royal service were people who had to choose between continued access to the institution and any continued connection with Crawford, and the choice was not difficult for most of them. They chose the institution. Of course they chose the institution. The institution was where their lives were. Crawford had no institution to choose. She had Buthley and the Kensington Palace House, and the income from the American publication, and the knowledge, settling on her slowly through the months of 1950, that the understanding she had operated on for 16 years, that the trust was mutual, that the relationship was real, that the warmth of all those years was something that would survive even a significant disappointment, had been an understanding she had constructed herself from insufficient evidence. The institution had not promised her the warmth would survive. The institution had not promised her anything. She had assumed. She had taken the warmth as evidence of something more durable than warmth, and the warmth had turned out to be, like everything else in the arrangement, conditional. What she had, and what the institution could not reach, was the book itself. The Little Princesses was in print. It was in American hands, in American shops, being read by American women who found in its pages an account of royal childhood that was more recognizable and more appealing than anything the official channels had ever produced. It was selling. It was being read. Whatever had been done to Crawford, the book existed in the world, outside the palace walls, outside the reach of the institutional silence that had been applied to its author. Crawford knew this. She held on to it in the way that people hold on to the one thing the situation cannot take from them. She also understood, in those months of 1950, that the income from the American publication was going to be finite. The serialization would run its course. The book royalties would not be a permanent income. The Kensington Palace house was not hers. Buthley's banking income was not sufficient on its own. The situation that had produced the decision to write the book had not been resolved by writing it. The situation was, if anything, more acute now that the avenue of royal social connection was definitively closed, and the professional reputation had been reframed as a cautionary tale. She needed to keep writing. She needed an outlet and an income, and a way of being publicly Crawford who knows about the royal family, rather than Crawford who betrayed the royal family. And she needed it to be something legitimate, something that did not repeat the category violation of the book, something that the palace could be displeased about without having the same grounds for the same response. She found Woman's Own. It was not a prestigious outlet. It was a widely read British weekly, a solid middle-class magazine with a large and loyal readership, the kind of publication that was the backbone of the women's press in post-war Britain. It was not what Crawford had trained for, what she had planned, what the Froebel Institute had prepared her for. It was income and an outlet and something to do, and Crawford, who was practical above most things, took it. She began contributing columns about the royal family, about royal customs, royal occasions, the texture and history of the world she had inhabited for 16 years. She wrote with the authority of genuine knowledge, which was real and which readers recognized as real. For a time, it worked. Not brilliantly, not in the way that restored anything she had lost, but functionally. She had something to write, and somewhere to put it, and people who read it, and a check that arrived at regular intervals. For a few years, this was enough. Then she made the mistake. Not a malicious mistake, not a calculated risk that she understood clearly and accepted anyway. A mistake in the ordinary, human, entirely unstrategic sense. A failure of attention at a specific moment, a piece of writing that went out without the check it required, and a consequence entirely disproportionate to the failure. But that is the next part of the story. Before it, there were a few years of something that at least resembled stability, and Crawford had learned enough by 1950 to understand that stability was not nothing. She held on to it for as long as it lasted. The Woman's Own years were not, on balance, bad ones. This sounds like faint praise, and is intended to be. Crawford was not reconstructing the life she had lost. She was not reclaiming the position the palace had removed, or the reputation it had dismantled. She was doing something more modest and more sustainable than either of those things. She was finding a way to keep moving through a situation that had, by any honest accounting, very few good options in it. The column ran regularly. She wrote about royal customs and royal occasions, about the history of the ceremonies and the traditions and the specific architecture of a world she had inhabited from the inside. The readership of Woman's Own was not reading her for sensation. They were reading her for the texture of knowledge that only genuine proximity produces, the small, specific details that no biography or official account contains, the particularity of someone who was actually there. Crawford gave them that. She was careful about it. She drew on what she knew without crossing the lines she had already crossed once, staying in the territory of custom and history and the general, rather than the personal and the specific and the revealing. The palace was not pleased with the columns. The palace was also not, for the first few years, actively disrupting them. What Crawford was writing was not The Little Princesses again. It was not a second act of the same offense. It was adjacent to the offense, certainly. She was still trading on the royal connection, still using the proximity the household had given her. But adjacency was not identity, and the palace chose, for a time, not to respond to it directly. This restraint was not warmth. It was institutional calculation. An official response to a woman's own column would have elevated the column's profile and confirmed Crawford's continued relevance in ways that suited neither the palace's framing of her nor its preference for her quiet diminishment. Better to let the columns run in silence. Better to allow her the small ongoing income and the modest ongoing readership, while maintaining the social exile that was the real punishment, the one that had no formal mechanism and no visible administration, and that therefore required no response. Crawford understood this, dimly. She was not unaware that her continued operation in this space was a form of tolerance rather than acceptance. She was outside the walls. She was writing about what was inside them from the outside. The walls remained closed. She was not invited in. Boothlet was there. This mattered more than it might appear to, in an account focused on the professional and the institutional. He was steady in the way that had always characterized him, not expressive, not given to the performed warmth that the world of royal service had surrounded Crawford with for 16 years. He was simply present, reliable. There when she came home from whatever the day had required, there at the breakfast table in the morning, there in the evenings, in the way that a person is there when they have decided that being there is the correct decision, and have not second-guessed it. Crawford was not, in these years, a broken person. She was a diminished one. The difference matters. Broken suggests something that has stopped functioning. Crawford continued to function, to write, to maintain the household, to conduct the ordinary business of a life. What had been diminished was the scale of the world she was functioning in. The 16-year world, the world that had contained palaces and state occasions, and the children of the monarch, had been replaced by a flat in London, a weekly column, a husband with a banking career of modest dimensions, and the knowledge that the replacement was permanent. She managed this. She had always been good at managing what the situation provided, rather than mourning what it withheld. Then came the summer of 1955. The column Crawford submitted to Woman's Own in June of that year described the Trooping the Colour ceremony. This was not an unusual subject for her. The Trooping the Colour was the sovereign's official birthday parade, an annual event of considerable visual splendour, the kind of set piece that the British state machine produced with the practiced efficiency of centuries of practice. Soldiers in full dress uniform, horses, the precision of military movement, the mall filling with people who had come to see something that was unmistakably and specifically English. Crawford had attended it many times during her years in royal service. She knew it in the way that she knew everything she had observed during those years, precisely, retentively, with the attentiveness of someone who had always found the world worth noticing. She wrote the column from that knowledge. She described the crowd gathering along the mall in the early morning, the soldiers forming up, the quality of the light on a London summer morning, the particular sound of military music in an open space, the colours being trooped before the regiment, the sovereign taking the salute. The column had the authority of genuine familiarity. It read, as Crawford's royal writing always read, as the account of someone who had been there. She had not been there. Trooping the Colour in 1955 had been cancelled. A national rail and bus strike had paralysed central London's transport network for several weeks, making the movement of troops and spectators impossible. The decision to cancel the ceremony had been made and had been publicly announced. The London papers had covered it. The cancellation was not obscure information. It was news that had run in every newspaper in Britain. Crawford had not checked. She had written the column from memory, from the accumulation of previous years, from the habitual confidence of someone whose knowledge of the royal calendar was so established that it had not occurred to her to verify whether the event she was describing had in fact occurred. She had assumed, and the assumption had been wrong, and the column had gone to the magazine, and the magazine had run it, and the readers who knew, which was most of them, because the strike had been significant news, had noticed immediately. The press reaction was not sympathetic. There is a specific quality of press enthusiasm that appears when a story confirms a narrative the press has already decided it is telling, and the Trooping the Colour story triggered it completely. Here was Crawford, the woman who had sold the royal family's intimate life to an American magazine, the woman whose name had become a shorthand for betrayal, now writing with confident first-person authority about a royal ceremony that had not happened. The story wrote itself, and the press wrote it, and they wrote it with the efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this. The column was dissected in print with a thoroughness that Crawford found, by her later account, genuinely shocking. Not the fact of the criticism. She had been living with criticism since 1950 and had developed a working relationship with it. What shocked her was the pleasure in it. The press treated the Trooping the Colour incident as a gift, a confirmation, a final piece of evidence for a portrait they had been constructing for 5 years. The word Crawford acquired a second definition. Not only someone who betrays the confidence of royal employers, now also someone who writes with authority about things they have not witnessed, someone who substitutes memory and assumption for direct knowledge and presents the result as eyewitness account. The two definitions were, on examination, contradictory. One described excess of truth, the other described a specific kind of invention, but in public use they fused into a single portrait, a woman whose relationship with both loyalty and accuracy was unreliable. The damage this did to the specific thing Crawford had been building through her woman's own years was total. She had been building, slowly and without fanfare, a position as someone whose knowledge of the royal family was genuine and whose writing about it could be trusted. The Trooping the Colour incident destroyed that position as efficiently as the book had destroyed the other position 5 years earlier. She had been trying to establish that she was a credible voice. She had published, in a major national magazine with a large readership, a detailed account of something that had not happened. The credibility was gone. The Woman's Own column ended, not with a formal dismissal, not with any particular drama. It simply did not continue after the summer of 1955, for reasons that did not need to be articulated. Crawford was 45 years old. The two avenues through which she had generated income since 1950 were now both closed. The American publication had run its course. The magazine column was gone. The social connections that might in other circumstances have provided alternative possibilities, people who might commission something, people who might introduce her to other people, the network that professional life generates and maintains, had been severed in 1950 and had not regenerated in the 5 years since. She was not destitute. The situation had not reached that point, but the trajectory was visible, and the trajectory was not moving in a direction that resolved the problems it contained. Boothleigh tried. He was there, as he had always been there, and he tried to be what the situation required him to be, which was simultaneously practical support and emotional anchor and patient witness to a series of losses he had not been responsible for and could not reverse. He was, by Crawford's own account in the oblique references she made to this period in later interviews, more than she could have asked for. He was also, and she knew this, and it made things harder, not enough. Not because of any failure on his part, because the losses were not the kind that a person, any person, however good, could make sufficient. What Crawford had lost was not just the income, it was the second income, the second version of a professional identity that she had patiently constructed from the wreckage of the first. The failure of the Trooping the Colour column had not simply ended the Woman's Own years. It had ended the possibility of the Woman's Own years being replaced by something else of the same kind. She could not now go to another publication with the same material and expect a different reception. She had been tried in public and found lacking in both loyalty and accuracy, and that finding followed her. The summer of 1955 was a difficult one. It became a more difficult autumn. By the end of the year, Crawford had attempted to take her own life. She survived. The details of the attempt are not in the public record with any precision. She did not discuss it publicly, and those close to her were similarly discreet about the specifics. What is in the record is the fact of it, mentioned in subsequent biographies with the matter-of-factness of something that is documented rather than doubted. She had tried, and had not succeeded, and had continued. The attempt was not irrational. This is not a comfortable thing to say, but it is an honest one. Crawford had given 16 years of her life to a family that had then removed every connection, every professional avenue, every social relationship that 16 years had built. She had made the one significant professional effort available to her and had been punished for it, with a thoroughness that went far beyond what the offense warranted. She had spent 5 years rebuilding from the rubble of that punishment and had been publicly humiliated by a mistake that, in any other context, would have been an embarrassing editorial failure and nothing more. She was 45 years old, without income, without the professional world that had been her world, without the social connections that constitute a life's texture, married to a man whose patience was real but whose resources were finite, living in a house she did not own and could not count on keeping. The letter from Elizabeth had never come. The letter from Margaret had never come. The Queen Mother had not written. The silence that had begun in 1950 was 5 years old and showing no sign of ending, and Crawford had by now accumulated enough evidence to understand that it was not going to end. It was not anger cooling into eventual forgiveness. It was the operational position of an institution that had made a decision and did not revisit decisions. She had understood this for some time. Understanding it intellectually and living inside it daily are different experiences, and the distance between them had, through 1955, become too wide to manage. She survived the attempt. She continued. The continuation was not triumphant or dramatic in either direction. It was simply the continuation of a woman who had always, in the end, organized herself around what was required of her, and what was required of her now was getting through the days, and she got through them. Buthley was there. The flat, they were no longer at the Kensington Palace house by this point, having moved to smaller accommodation that the diminished circumstances required, was there. The Scottish winter of the mind that had settled on Crawford's life in 1950 was there, and continued to be there, and showed no signs of lifting. But she was alive, and she kept writing, in the private form that had always been the baseline of her writing life, the notebooks, the private record, the habit of paying attention that no institution could mandate and no silence could reach. It was not enough, but it was what she had, and Crawford, who had always been practical above most things, worked with what she had. The worst years were not yet over. The worst years had some distance still to run. But Crawford had survived 1955, which was the year the worst years declared themselves most clearly, and survival, at this point in the story, was not nothing. It was, in fact, the only thing she had that nobody could take from her. Aberdeen is a city that does not pretend to be something it isn't. It sits on Scotland's northeast coast, where the River Dee meets the North Sea, and the North Sea in that part of the world is not the romantic sea of postcards. It is cold and grey and functional, a working sea, a sea that has been used for centuries by people who needed it, rather than people who wanted to look at it. The city itself has the same quality: granite buildings, granite light in winter, a directness of manner that people who are not from there sometimes mistake for coldness, and people who are from there understand as honesty. It does not flatter, it does not perform. What it is, it is. Crawford moved there with Buthley sometime in the late 1950s. The exact timing is not sharply documented, which is consistent with how the Aberdeen years are documented generally, in outline rather than detail, in the broad shape of what happened rather than the specific texture of the days. She had left London. She had left the proximity to Kensington Palace, to Buckingham Palace, to the world that had been hers for 16 years and had been withheld from her for 8 more. She had left the city where the Woman's Own column had failed, and the suicide attempt had happened, and the trajectory of the preceding years had made its destination clear. Aberdeen was a clean break in the geographic sense. Whether it provided any other kind of break is harder to establish. Buthley had some professional connection there, some thread of his banking career that gave the move a practical logic beyond the desire to be somewhere else. Crawford had no particular connection, no friends from earlier life, no professional network, no history with the city. She was in her late 40s, in a place she had not built a life in, and the task of building one now, under these circumstances, was not straightforward. She wrote, "This is the thing Crawford always returned to when everything else contracted. Not because writing was always productive in the commercial sense, but because it was the one activity that connected the person she was now to the person she had always been. She had been writing since before the royal years. She wrote through them. She wrote after them, first for the Ladies' Home Journal, then for Woman's Own, then in the diminished form that remained after both of those avenues closed. The notebooks continued. The private record continued. The habit of paying attention and making that attention legible on the page continued, even when the page was private and the audience was nobody. She placed occasional pieces in various publications during the late 1950s and into the 1960s. Not royal material. That avenue was closed, and closed definitively, and Crawford was realistic enough not to attempt it again after 1955. She wrote about domestic life, about household matters, about the practical territory that women's publications of the era consistently required and consistently paid for at the modest rates that modest publications paid. The income was not substantial. It was income. Boothlay's banking career had encountered difficulties that the public record does not describe in detail. What the public record contains, in the oblique language that biographies use when they are working from limited sources, is the suggestion that the Boothlay's financial situation through the late 1950s and into the 1960s was more pressured than it had appeared from outside. Boothly was a capable man in his field. He was also a man in his late 50s, managing a career in a changed post-war financial landscape, and the changed landscape did not always suit the methods and the connections he had built in the pre-war one. They were not destitute. The word comes up in connection with Crawford's later years, and it is important to be precise about it. Destitution, in the clinical sense of having nothing at all, was not the situation. The situation was more insidious than that. It was the situation of two people who had enough to be getting on with and not enough to feel secure, who were managing from month to month with the specific anxiety of people who understand that the margin between managing and not managing is narrower than it looks, and who understood further that the margin was not widening as the years went on. Crawford gave interviews occasionally through these years, not many, and not long, and not to outlets that would have given them significant reach. She was careful in them, professionally careful, the same carefulness she had demonstrated since 1932, the trained habit of not saying more than the situation required. She did not attack the royal family in these interviews. She expressed what she felt without weaponizing it, which is a harder thing to do than it sounds when what you feel has reasonable cause behind it. What she expressed was, consistently, some combination of two things that should have been contradictory, but that Crawford managed to hold simultaneously, without apparent strain. The first was genuine love for the people she had served, not performed, not strategic, not the residue of sentiment that has nowhere else to go. She loved Elizabeth and Margaret in the specific way that you love people you have watched closely for years, whose formation you were part of, whose inner life you knew in the way that only sustained and attentive daily presence permits. She loved the Duke, in the memory of him, for his courage with the stammer, and his quietness, and the garden at 145 Piccadilly. She even loved the Queen Mother, in the complicated way of someone who loves a person who has done something unforgivable to them, and cannot resolve the contradiction cleanly. The second thing was bewilderment, not rage, not bitterness in the form that produces denunciations and revelations, and the kind of public performance that would have sold newspapers, and given her a much larger platform than the modest interviews she gave actually provided. Bewilderment. The flat, genuine, unresolvable bewilderment of someone who has been treated in a way that does not compute, who has examined the situation from every available angle, and cannot make the punishment fit the offense, cannot find the proportionality that would make the response comprehensible. She had written a kind book. She had written it under financial pressure that the institution had produced by failing to make any provision for her retirement. She had loved the people she wrote about, and the love was visible on every page. She had been destroyed for it. These were the facts, and Crawford held them in sequence in the interviews she gave, and the sequence did not resolve into a conclusion that she found satisfying, because there was no satisfying conclusion available. She wrote to the palace more than once during the Aberdeen years. This is documented in the biographical record, and is worth understanding in its specific character. Crawford was not, by the time she wrote these letters, writing out of any realistic expectation that they would produce a response. She was writing in the way that people write when they need to say something and have no other way to say it. Not a strategy, not an appeal, not even truly a request, more like a record, more like saying, to the silence, that she was still there, and had not forgotten, and had not revised her understanding of what had happened, or her sense that the understanding deserved acknowledgement. The letters received no reply. None of them, at any point, received any reply. Not a formal refusal, not an acknowledgement of receipt. The palace machinery through which correspondence was processed did not, in Crawford's case, produce any output. The letters went in, and nothing came out. Elizabeth II, through the 1960s, was managing a monarchy that was adjusting to the post-war world in ways that required constant institutional attention. The empire was becoming the Commonwealth. The constitutional relationship with government was being negotiated in the context of a changed political landscape. The public role of the monarchy was being reimagined, slowly and carefully, by people who understood that the institution needed to evolve without appearing to evolve. She was busy in the way that people at the center of large and complicated institutions are busy, not with individual tasks, but with the continuous management of an enormously complex whole. Crawford was not the whole. Crawford was one person from the past, someone the institution had dealt with in 1950, and whose file, if such a thing existed, was closed. Margaret, through these years, was living the complicated and often publicly painful life of someone who had been given a particular kind of visibility without the compensating structures that might have made the visibility manageable. Her personal life was tabloid material in ways that Elizabeth's never quite was. Her social circle, her choices, the gap between the role she was supposed to occupy and the person she actually was, all of this played out in public in ways that Crawford, watching from Aberdeen, would have recognized. She had understood the architecture of Margaret's difficulty since Margaret was a small child. The adult version of the difficulty was the childhood version, made larger and provided with a press corps. Margaret did not write. The Queen Mother was aging into the particular form of public belovedness that she occupied for the last several decades of her very long life. She was photographed at racecourses and at public events and at the occasions that the monarchy organized and she appeared at, and the public received her with the warmth that her public character had always generated and that she had always known how to generate. She was good at this. She had been good at it since she was a young duchess in the 1920s. The skill had not diminished. She did not write to Crawford. The Queen Mother would live until 2002. She would outlive Crawford by 14 years and would not break the silence at any point during those 14 years. Not publicly, not privately, not through any intermediary. The silence she maintained about Marion Crawford was of the same order as the silences she maintained about other things she had decided. Absolute, unreviewed, carried as a position, rather than felt as an ongoing choice. She had decided, and the decision held. Buthley died in 1977. He died in Aberdeen, in the city he and Crawford had come to for the clean break, after 2 decades of marriage that had contained considerably more difficulty than either of them had planned for, and considerably more loyalty than the circumstances might have demanded. He was 67. Crawford was 67 also. They had been married for 30 years. The marriage had not been the life they had imagined when Crawford retired in 1948, and they moved into the Kensington Palace house with the expectation that the private future they had been building towards since 1932 was finally, properly beginning. That expectation had not survived 1950. The life they actually had was different from the one they had planned, shaped by losses neither of them had chosen, and by financial pressures neither of them had anticipated, and by the particular weight of Crawford's situation, which Buthley had carried alongside her without complaint, and without, as far as the record shows, any revision of his original commitment. He had waited 15 years to marry her. He had then spent 30 years married to her, under conditions he had not signed up for. The patience and the loyalty of this are not small things, and Crawford knew it, and the knowledge of it was part of what she carried when he died. She was alone. Not immediately, dramatically alone in the sense of having no one at all. There were neighbors, there were the ordinary connections of the Aberdeen years, there were the people that 2 people accumulate around themselves when they live somewhere for 2 decades, but alone in the structural sense that matters. The person who had been the fixed point of the private life she had built outside the royal world was gone. The private world had always been small. It was now smaller by the person who had made it a world rather than a collection of days. She was 67 and alone in Aberdeen, and the palace had not written. She had strokes. The first one came in the early 1980s. It arrived with the particular brutality of strokes, which do not negotiate and do not give warning and do not arrange themselves around the convenience of the person they happen to. It narrowed Crawford's world. Her capacity to write, which had been the thread connecting her current life to every version of her life before it, was affected. Her capacity to manage the ordinary logistics of daily existence, the flat, the correspondence, the movement through the city, became more difficult and progressively more so. A second stroke followed, then, by some accounts, a third. Each one took something. The accumulation of what was taken moved her further from the person she had been and closer to the person she would be at the end. The money was genuinely a problem by this point. Crawford's executor, in the period after her death, described her financial situation in terms that were vague about amounts and clear about the essential fact. She had not accumulated resources during her working life that could sustain her in the form of decline she was experiencing. The Grace and Favour house was decades in the past. The woman's own income was 30 years gone. The lady's home journal royalties had been finite and were spent. Buthley's income was no longer there. What remained was whatever she had been able to maintain through the occasional writing income of the Aberdeen years, and whatever savings existed from the various periods of the preceding decades. It was not enough to make the end easy. The palace received no requests for assistance from Crawford. This is not documented in either direction. There is no record of Crawford asking, and no record of the palace being asked and declining. What the record contains is the absence of any provision, any acknowledgement, any belated recognition that the woman who had educated the Queen was managing her final years in conditions that were considerably harder than they needed to be. Whether this absence was deliberate or simply the continuation of the operational assumption that Crawford had been dealt with in 1950 and the file was closed, whether the institution considered the question and declined to act on it, or whether the question never arose, the record does not say. What the record says is what happened. What happened was nothing. Crawford spent the final years in the Aberdeen flat with declining health and declining resources, and the accumulated weight of everything the preceding decades had contained, and nobody from the royal family came. She gave one more interview during this period. The interviewer came to Aberdeen and found a woman who was physically diminished by the strokes, but who had not, in the essential sense, been diminished in the ways that matter more. She was still Crawford, still precise, still honest, still giving the interview that the situation provided, rather than the one the interviewer had perhaps hoped for. She did not produce revelations. She did not perform bitterness. She said what she had said in the earlier interviews, more quietly now, with the flatness of long processing, rather than the rawness of recent wound. She said she had loved those children. The interviewer asked about the silence. Crawford looked at the interviewer for a moment before answering. The biographers who have pieced together this period suggest. Then she said something that was not quite an answer, and was more than an answer, something that acknowledged the silence without performing grief about it, that named it without either forgiving it or condemning it. She said she had never fully understood it. This, in the end, is the most Crawford thing she ever said. Not a denunciation, not a plea, not a performance of suffering designed to generate sympathy. The honest statement of a woman who had examined the situation throughout the decades of its duration and had arrived, at the end of those decades, not at acceptance or bitterness, but at genuine bewilderment. She had given everything she had to people who had then behaved as though she had given them nothing. She had never been able to make this make sense, and she did not pretend, at the end of her life, in that Aberdeen flat, that she had. It did not make sense. It had never made sense. It would not make sense now. On the 2nd of June 1953, Elizabeth II was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey, and the ceremony was filmed and broadcast to the nation, and millions of people watched it on television sets in their living rooms, and in shop windows, and in church halls, where the sets had been borrowed for the occasion, and the general verdict was that it had been magnificent. Crawford watched from Aberdeen. She had been inside the institution that produced this spectacle for 16 years. She had known the woman at its center since the woman was 6 years old. She had been the one, in the schoolroom at 145 Piccadilly, who had taught that woman what a coronation was, what the orb meant, what the scepter represented, what the ancient words of the oath committed the person saying them to. She had been in Westminster Abbey in 1937, when Elizabeth had watched her father be crowned, and she had watched Elizabeth watch it, and she had written in her notebook that evening that the child knew exactly what she was seeing and what it meant for her own future. She was not in Westminster Abbey in 1953. She was in Aberdeen, watching a television set, in the same relationship to the spectacle as everyone else in Britain who was not there, which was to say, at a complete remove from the world she had spent 16 years at the center of. There is a particular quality of distance that comes not from never having been close, but from having been close and then not being close. The person who has never been inside the thing looks at it and sees the thing itself. The person who has been inside it and been removed from it looks at it and sees the gap between what they are seeing and what they know. Crawford, watching the coronation, was not watching what the camera showed. She was watching the gap, the space between the official portrait and the private reality she had inhabited, the space that the little princesses had tried to close and that the palace had punished her for closing. Elizabeth in the coronation footage was extraordinary. Crawford would have known this, and known also that the extraordinariness was not accidental, that what the camera was capturing was the product of years of formation, of constitutional education, of the particular discipline of someone who had organized herself around the requirements of this moment since she was 10 years old. Crawford had been part of that formation. The formation was visible in the footage. The person who had helped produce it was watching from Aberdeen, with no acknowledgement that she had been involved. She was 43 years old. The reign she was watching begin on that television set would last 70 years. She would be dead 35 years before it ended. Philip was there, at the coronation, in the position he would occupy for the rest of the reign. Not quite beside Elizabeth in the constitutional sense, not quite behind her, in the specific and somewhat uncomfortable position of a man of formidable intelligence and energy, who has married someone whose role structurally precludes him from occupying the foreground in any room they share. Crawford had observed the early stages of the relationship during the war years, the letters, the visits to Windsor, the particular quality of Elizabeth's attention when Philip's name came up. She had understood it as a genuine attachment in the specific mode of Elizabeth's character, decided, quiet, not performed, durable. She had been right about that. Whatever the later tabloid coverage made of the marriage and its difficulties, the attachment was real and it lasted. Crawford, watching from Aberdeen, would have known this without needing the newspapers to tell her. She had understood Elizabeth's character well enough to understand that a decision Elizabeth had made in that mode would not be revised. She had also, in the quiet of the Aberdeen years, thought about what the reign would be and what it would mean. Not enviously. Crawford was not, by temperament or by training, an envious person. Philosophically, she had spent the years since 1950 thinking, in the way of someone with a great deal of time and a great deal to think about what the institution actually was and what it actually did to the people involved with it. And the thinking had produced conclusions that were not comfortable, but that were honest. The institution produced something real. The coronation footage showed that. The woman on the throne, with the orb and the scepter and the ancient words and the composed face that contained everything Crawford had watched it contain since 1932, was the product of something real and serious and not easily dismissed. The monarchy was not merely a performance. It was a load-bearing structure in the political and cultural life of the country, and the person carrying it in 1953 was suited to the carrying in ways that were, Crawford would have acknowledged without difficulty, genuinely impressive. The institution also did what it had done to Crawford. Both things were true simultaneously. The institution that produced that coronation and the institution that had destroyed Crawford's life were the same institution, operating according to the same logic, with the same imperatives and the same methods. The monarchy that millions of people watched with genuine feeling on the 2nd of June 1953 was the monarchy that had applied total social exile to a woman who had written a kind book about 2 children. Crawford held both truths. She did not resolve them into each other. They remained, through the Aberdeen years, as two separate facts that the same story contained. Margaret's story, running parallel to Elizabeth's through the 1950s and beyond, would have landed differently on Crawford than it landed on the general public, because Crawford's knowledge of what she was watching was different from the general public's. The public knew Margaret as the glamorous, unpredictable, sometimes brilliant, and sometimes self-destructive younger sister, whose personal life provided a continuous supply of tabloid material from the mid-1950s onward. The relationship with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced man, a war hero, someone the palace determined was constitutionally unacceptable, played out through 1953 and 1955, in public, in ways that drew obvious comparison to 1936. Crawford had watched 1936 from the inside. She was watching 1955 from Aberdeen, and what she was watching, she would have understood, was the institution applying to Margaret the same arithmetic it had applied to Edward, and the same implicit arithmetic it had applied to Crawford herself. The institution had requirements. The requirements were not negotiable. The person who failed to meet them paid the appropriate price. Margaret paid it by not marrying Townsend. She announced, in October 1955, that she would not marry him, citing her duty to the Commonwealth and the Church. The statement was gracious and probably cost her something real, and Crawford, who had understood Margaret's emotional architecture since Margaret was learning to walk, would have read the cost behind the gracious statement with an accuracy that the newspapers could not quite manage. Margaret married Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960. The marriage lasted 18 years and was unhappy in ways that became progressively less private. They divorced in 1978. Margaret's subsequent years were marked by illness, by the specific kind of sadness that comes from a life that has been lived at high intensity without the structures that high intensity requires, and by the continued public attention that the royal family generates, regardless of whether the person receiving it wants it. Crawford had told anyone who would listen, in the years when there was anyone to tell, that Margaret's position was the most structurally difficult position in the family. That being the second daughter of a constitutional monarch was a specific kind of impossible, that the visibility without purpose, the prominence without function, the being the spare in an institution that required an heir, was a recipe for exactly the difficulties that Margaret's adult life produced. She had understood this when Margaret was 7 years old. She had managed it as best she could within the constraints available to her. She watched it unfold from Aberdeen with the specific sorrow of someone who saw it coming and was not there to help, and would not have been permitted to help if she had been there. Elizabeth II, through the 1960s and 1970s, was navigating a monarchy that was being asked to justify itself to a changing country in ways that previous generations of the institution had not quite had to manage. The empire was gone. The class structure that had provided the monarchy's social context was eroding. Television had changed the relationship between the public and the institution in ways that created both opportunity and danger. The opportunity of direct access, the danger of visibility unmediated by the careful management that official channels provided. The palace responded to these pressures with a combination of careful opening and careful control that was, by any assessment, skillfully managed. The 1969 documentary, Royal Family, gave cameras inside Balmoral in ways that were genuinely unprecedented, and produced a portrait that the public responded to with enthusiasm. It was, in its way, the opposite of what Crawford had done in 1950, the same dissolving of the boundary between private and public, the same revealing of the family as human, but managed and controlled and produced by the institution itself, rather than by someone it had employed. Crawford noticed this, presumably from Aberdeen. She noticed it with whatever feeling was appropriate to noticing that the thing she had been destroyed for doing was now being done by the institution itself, on its own terms, with its own cameras, for its own purposes. She was, by this point, too far through the experience of her own situation to feel much about the irony. Irony requires energy. Crawford's energy, through the 1970s, was directed at the ordinary requirements of the Aberdeen years. Then Buthley died. Then the strokes. Then the accelerating diminishment of the 1980s. She was found dead in her Aberdeen flat on the 11th of February, 1988. The details of what the flat contained and what it didn't, belonged to the kind of historical record that accumulates in the absence of official account, in the biographies written later, in the interviews given by people who knew her in Aberdeen, in the executor's statement about her estate. The flat was not large, the resources were not abundant, the end was not dramatic or public, or attended by anyone who might subsequently have described it as something that had been met with dignity, because there was nobody there to make that observation. She was 77 years old. She had survived 16 years of royal service, 5 years of post-publication fighting to maintain a professional identity, the suicide attempt of 1955, 3 decades in Aberdeen, Buthley's death, the strokes. She had survived all of it, and then she had not survived the ordinary biological process that claims everyone at the end, and she died. The royal family said nothing. This has been stated in this account before, in the hook at the beginning, and it bears stating again in this context, because the context now has everything behind it that the hook did not. We know, now, what Crawford was. We know what she gave, and what she did not receive, and what she was punished for, and how long the punishment ran. We know what the children she raised became, and what they chose not to do about the woman who raised them. We know about the letters that went unanswered, and the silence that lasted 38 years. In that context, the fact that the royal family said nothing when Crawford died is not a small administrative detail. It is the conclusion of the story. It is the institution completing the logic of the decision it had made in 1950, not with cruelty, not with satisfaction, but with the institutional consistency that was, on its best days, one of the monarchy's defining qualities, and, on this day, and on all the days of the preceding 38 years, something else entirely. Elizabeth II was 61 when Crawford died, 36. She had been queen for 36 years. She had 1 year left in the reign when she died, in 2022, which means she outlived Crawford by 34 years, and never, in those 34 years, made any public acknowledgement of the woman who had taught her to read. No statement, no private communication that became part of any record, no revisiting, in any form that history can access, of the decision made in 1950. She was, by all accounts, a woman of genuine decency. She was also the head of an institution whose imperatives she had, throughout her reign, subordinated herself to with a consistency that was both her greatest strength and, in this specific case, the mechanism through which something unjust was administered without apparent discomfort. Decent people administer unjust things all the time. This is not an exculpation. It is a description of how institutions work, how they enable people who are genuinely good to do things that are genuinely bad without experiencing the actions as bad, because the institutional frame makes the actions look like something else. Policy, precedent, the requirements of the role, the necessity of maintaining the standards that the institution depends on. Crawford understood this, in the Aberdeen years, more clearly than she had understood it when she was inside the institution. Distance produces clarity. She had a great deal of distance and a great deal of time, and what the distance and the time produced in her was not peace but comprehension, a clear-eyed understanding of what had happened to her and why, without the comfort of the understanding being the same as the acceptance of it. She died, having never accepted it. The evidence suggests she died still genuinely bewildered by the gap between what she had given and what she had received, still unable, after 38 years, to make the punishment fit the offense. That inability is not a failure of her understanding, it is the correct response to something that did not fit. The punishment did not fit the offense. It never did. The institution was not interested in fitting. The institution was interested in maintaining the precedent, and the precedent required the punishment to be total, and total it remained, and Marion Crawford carried it until she could not carry anything anymore. The flat in Aberdeen, the 11th of February, 1988. The end of a story that should have ended differently. The royal family said nothing. The press, to its credit, said quite a lot. The obituaries that appeared in the British press in February 1988 did something that the living coverage of Marion Crawford had rarely managed. They thought about her. Not universally. Some of the obituaries ran the standard version, the one the palace had been maintaining since 1950. Governess who betrayed trust, published books she shouldn't have published, became figure of ridicule when she described a ceremony that didn't happen. Cautionary tale, end of story. That version was available and required very little effort to produce, because it had been in circulation for 38 years, and its outlines were familiar to any journalist who covered the royal family with any regularity. But other obituaries did something different. They looked at the material of Crawford's life with the specific kind of attention that obituaries sometimes produce, and that living coverage rarely does. The attention of someone who is trying to establish what a life actually was, rather than what the most convenient framing of it has always been. And what that attention produced, in the better obituaries of February 1988, was a version of Crawford's story that was recognizably different from the one the palace had preferred. The Times ran a piece that acknowledged the Trooping the Colour incident, and the book, and the palace's response, and then, in the final third, began to ask questions that the preceding 3 decades of coverage had not asked. What exactly had Crawford been given in exchange for her silence? What provisions had the royal household made for her retirement? What had the institution offered the woman who had educated the heir to the throne, in concrete and enforceable terms, when her service was concluded? The answers to these questions, assembled from the available record, were not flattering to the institution. No pension, no written guarantee of anything, a grace and favour house that had been a genuine benefit and was eventually no longer available. The assurance of continuing connection that had been withdrawn in 1950 with total and permanent efficiency. These were the facts on the institution's side of the ledger. Against them, on Crawford's side, was 16 years of daily service, the surrender of a career she had trained for and intended to inhabit, the surrender of the relationship with Buthley through most of her 20s and 30s, the surrender of the chance to have children of her own, a loss she rarely discussed, but that the biographers who came later understood was real and significant. The ledger, examined honestly, did not balance. Several obituary writers made this observation in one form or another. Not all of them drew explicit conclusions from it. There was still, in 1988, a reflexive deference in British journalism toward the institution that made direct criticism of the monarchy's treatment of Crawford feel like overstepping. But the observation was there, in print, which meant it was there for the biographers and the documentary makers and the reassessors who would follow over the next 2 decades. What the obituaries also did was rehabilitate, partially and tentatively, the book itself. The Little Princesses had been out of serious critical discussion for 30 years by 1988. It had been referenced, consistently, as the thing Crawford had done wrong rather than as a text with qualities worth assessing on its own terms. The obituaries that engaged with it seriously found, when they read it or read it again, a document considerably less explosive than its reputation suggested. They found affection. They found specificity. They found 2 children described with the particular accuracy of someone who had paid close attention over a long time, and who wrote about what she had seen, rather than what would sell best. One obituary writer noted that The Little Princesses contained less damaging material than was routinely published about the royal family in any given week of tabloid coverage in 1988, and that the gap between the palace's response in 1950 and the actual content of the book was wide enough to raise serious questions about what the palace had really been protecting. The answer that suggested itself was not state secrets or personal reputations, but something more structural. The principle itself, the precedent, the categorical insistence that people inside the institution did not write about the inside, enforced visibly and totally so that everyone else in service understood the cost. Crawford had been the enforcement. The obituaries, in their better versions, began to say this plainly. The rehabilitation that followed in the 1990s was slow and incomplete and never endorsed by the palace, which continued to maintain the silence it had established in 1950, as though silence were a policy that had no expiry date. But it was real. The cultural reconsideration of Crawford's story moved through several distinct stages over the decade following her death, each one adding something to the portrait that the Crawford framing had obscured. The first stage was the biographies. Serious biographies of Elizabeth II, written with the historical distance that the later decades of the reign permitted, and with access to sources that had not been available earlier, began to engage with Crawford's role in the Queen's formation more substantively than anything published during Crawford's lifetime. The constitutional education, the wartime Windsor years, the pantomimes, the specific relationships Crawford had built with both princesses, these things appeared in the biographical record not as background color, but as genuine history, as material that mattered for understanding who Elizabeth II actually was and how she had become that person. The biographies were careful. They were not polemical about Crawford's treatment. They documented rather than condemned, which is what serious biography does, and the documentation, assembled and presented with scholarly care, spoke for itself. You could read the account of what Crawford had given and what she had received, laid out in chronological sequence by a biographer whose job was to be accurate rather than kind to the institution, and you could form your own conclusions. The conclusions available were not complicated. Several of these biographies noted, in passing or at length, that Crawford's name had become a byword for betrayal in royal circles, and that this framing was, on examination, significantly more favorable to the institution than the facts warranted. That a woman who had written an affectionate memoir should be destroyed professionally and socially, while the institution she had served went without examination, was an outcome the historical record could now be allowed to note. The second stage was the documentaries. British television in the 1990s and 2000s developed an appetite for royal history that went beyond the reverential coverage of earlier decades. The programs that appeared about Crawford and about the broader world of royal service she represented brought her story to audiences who had never heard of the little princesses and who encountered the Crawford framing for the first time in a context that also contained the full history behind it. For these audiences, the framing did not hold. They were watching a woman who had given everything she had to an institution that had given her nothing in writing and had then, when she needed income and had used the only asset available to her, destroyed her with a thoroughness that the television presenters consistently described as disproportionate. Disproportionate was the word that kept appearing through the 1990s and into the 2000s in the reassessment of Crawford's treatment. It appeared in the biographies. It appeared in the documentaries. It appeared in the newspaper features that the anniversaries of various events in the story produced, the 50th anniversary of the book's publication, the various anniversaries of Crawford's death, the occasions that gave journalists a reason to look at the material again. The palace said nothing about any of this. This was consistent with how the palace managed most things, through the discipline of not responding to things it preferred not to dignify with a response. The silence that had covered Crawford since 1950 extended, with perfect consistency, over the posthumous reassessment of her story. No one from the institution participated in any documentary about her. No one provided any statement for any biography. No one suggested, through any of the official or semi-official channels through which the palace occasionally communicated its views, that the situation had been managed in any way that might in hindsight be reconsidered. The silence, in the context of the reassessment, said something. The biographies and documentaries were making the argument that Crawford had been treated unjustly, and the palace's response was to not respond, which in the circumstances was its own kind of confirmation. If the treatment had been just, the record was there to make the case. The palace did not make it. What the palace did, through these years, was continue to function as it had always functioned, managing the present, preparing for what was coming, looking forward with the institutional discipline that had always been its defining characteristic. The past was managed by silence. The silence worked for the institution in most cases. In Crawford's case, it was working less well than it had, because the silence itself had become part of the story, and the story was not going away. The Little Princesses was reprinted. This happened in 1993, when a publisher decided that the combination of the book's historical significance and the growing public interest in reassessing Crawford's story made a new edition commercially viable. The new edition included a foreword that placed the book in its historical context, and that was, by the standards of what had been written about Crawford since 1950, considerably more sympathetic to its author than most of what had come before. The book found new readers who came to it without the freight of the original publication context, without the Crawford framing, without the trooping the colour incident already attached to the author's name, without the 38 years of institutional punishment as the lens through which the text was read. They found what was actually there, a warm, specific, honest account of royal childhood, written with genuine affection by someone who had been there and who clearly felt the being there as a privilege rather than an opportunity for exploitation. The reviews of the reprinted edition used words that the 1950 coverage had not used: affectionate, dignified, restrained. One reviewer noted that if you removed the author's name and the historical context and simply read the text on its own terms, you would describe it as a fond and well-written memoir of an unusual professional life, and you would have no obvious mechanism for understanding why it had destroyed the person who wrote it. This was the question the reassessment kept returning to, in different forms, across the 1990s and 2000s. Not why Crawford had written the book. The financial and professional circumstances that had produced that decision were, by now, well enough documented that the why was not mysterious. But why the response had been what it was. Why total and permanent and administered without apparent reconsideration. Why the institution that had produced genuine warmth over 16 years had been capable of switching that warmth off so completely and keeping it off for so long. The answer that the biographers arrived at, from different directions and with different emphases, was essentially the same answer. The response was not about Crawford specifically, it was about what Crawford represented, the risk that any person with genuine inside knowledge of the royal family posed to the institution's management of its own image. The punishment was not calibrated to Crawford's specific offense, it was calibrated to the precedent. The precedent required the punishment to be visible, total, and sustained, because the precedent was only useful as a deterrent if it demonstrated clearly what the cost of the offense was. Crawford was the demonstration. She was punished comprehensively, not because she had done something comprehensively wrong, but because the institution needed the punishment to be comprehensive, so that everyone else would understand what comprehensive meant. This is a cold analysis, and it is correct, and the biographers who made it were careful to note that it was cold, that the people who administered the punishment were not cold people, were in fact people of genuine warmth in other contexts, were people who had loved Crawford in the way that you love someone who has been reliably present in your life for 16 years. The warmth and the punishment both existed. The institution made them compatible by separating the personal from the institutional and maintaining the separation with the same discipline that it maintained everything else. Crawford was personally loved and institutionally dispensable, and when the institutional and the personal came into conflict in 1950, the institutional won without a fight, because within the logic of the institution, there was no fight to be had. Elizabeth II understood this logic from her earliest formation. She had been formed inside the institution's logic by the woman who was then sacrificed to it. The irony of this was not available for comment from the palace, and the palace ensured it remained unavailable. Margaret died in February 2002. She was 71 years old and had been in poor health for several years. Her death generated enormous public sympathy and a wave of retrospective reassessment that was, in the main, considerably kinder to her than the contemporary coverage of her adult life had been. The complex of frustrations and losses and structural impossibilities that Crawford had watched forming in a 7-year-old at Windsor during the war found, in the retrospective coverage of 2002, a more sympathetic hearing than it had found while Margaret was alive to complicate the sympathy. Crawford had understood Margaret's situation with a precision that none of the 2002 obituaries quite matched, because Crawford had understood it from the inside and from the beginning. She had been dead for 14 years by the time anyone publicly said what she had privately understood since 1941. The Queen Mother died 6 weeks after Margaret, in March 2002, at 101. The coverage was enormous and reverential and extended. She had been the most beloved member of the royal family for most of her public life, and the public affection at her death was genuine in the way that the public affection she generated throughout her life had been genuine, produced by someone who was very good at producing it, and who had, whatever her private qualities, the real gift of making people feel that they mattered to her. She had maintained the silence about Crawford for 52 years. She carried it to her death. The obituaries noted her warmth, her courage during the Blitz, her long service, her remarkable age. Some of them mentioned Marion Crawford in passing. None of the official coverage made anything of the connection. Elizabeth II died on the 8th of September 2022 at Balmoral, at 96 years old, after 70 years on the throne. The coverage was vast, sustained, global. She had been a figure of stability and constitutional seriousness for 7 decades, and the public response to her death reflected this. Genuine and large, and not easily dismissed as mere sentiment, she had been, on the evidence of her reign, exactly what the institution required, with a consistency and a dedication that no one who watched it closely could fail to admire. She had been Marion Crawford's pupil before she was any of the things her reign made her. She had died without saying anything publicly about the woman who had taught her to read. Whether she thought about Crawford in the last years of her life, in the last months, in the final days at Balmoral, the record does not say. The record says only what she did. What she did was nothing. And the nothing was, by the end of this account, not surprising. It was the conclusion of a logic that had been operating since 1950, executed with the same consistency that had characterized the logic throughout. The institution's relationship with Marion Crawford was established in 1950 and maintained without revision until the last person capable of revising it was dead. The institution got what it wanted. The question the next part of this story asks is what Crawford got. The answer is not nothing. The answer is not the answer you might expect from an account that has spent 11 parts documenting what was taken from her. The answer is the thing the institution could not reach. There is a question that has been running underneath this entire account, appearing at the edges of each part and never quite arriving at the center, and part 12 is where it arrives. The question is not what Marion Crawford did wrong. That has been answered. She wrote a kind book about people she loved, without a written contract prohibiting it, under financial pressure the institution had produced by failing to make any provision for her retirement, and she was destroyed for it. The question is not whether the destruction was proportionate. That has been answered too. It was not. There is no version of honest arithmetic in which 38 years of total silence is the proportionate response to the little princesses. The question that has been running underneath everything is this: what does it mean that the institution was capable of it? Not capable in the sense of having the power to do it. The royal family's capacity to close social and professional doors is not a mystery and requires no explanation. Capable in the deeper sense. Capable of taking 16 years of genuine service from a woman, taking the best years of her professional life, taking the relationship she had deferred, taking her chance at a family of her own, taking everything the institution needed and could use, and then, when the woman used the one asset available to her to secure her own survival, capable of responding with a punishment that lasted longer than the service itself, and that ended only because the people administering it died. Capable of this, and of continuing to be, in every other context, people who were described as decent. This is the thing about Crawford's story that is not comfortable to sit with, and that the Crawford framing was specifically designed to avoid sitting with. The framing made the story simple. Governess betrayed trust, received consequences, lesson learned. Simple stories have the advantage of not requiring you to ask the questions that complicated stories make unavoidable. The simple story ends with Crawford as the lesson. The complicated story ends with the question of what the lesson is actually teaching. What it is actually teaching is something about institutions, about the specific way that large and powerful institutions relate to the individuals within them, particularly the individuals whose closeness to the center makes them most valuable and most dangerous simultaneously. The royal household needed Crawford's proximity. Her proximity was the thing that made her useful, the daily access, the genuine relationship, the trust of the 2 children she was managing. All of that required her to be close, to be inside, to know things. The institution was granting her knowledge as a condition of her usefulness. The knowledge was not incidental to the role. It was the role, and then, when the role was over, and the knowledge remained in Crawford's possession, and Crawford needed income, and the institution had made no provision for that income, the institution responded to Crawford's use of what it had put in her hands, with the totality of its available response. There is a word for an arrangement in which one party takes everything it needs, and provides nothing enforceable in return, and punishes the other party for attempting to address the imbalance. The word is not a comfortable one to apply to the royal family of the United Kingdom. But Crawford's story makes the application unavoidable, and the discomfort of the application is exactly what the Crawford framing has been managing for 7 decades. The framing has been remarkably successful. The name still carries its meaning. There are people working in royal service today who understand perfectly what doing a Crawford means, and who understand it as a warning about disloyalty, rather than as an account of what the institution did to the person whose name the warning carries. The framing has outlasted Crawford. It has outlasted Elizabeth II. It has outlasted everyone who was personally involved in the events of 1950. What has also outlasted all of them is the book. The Little Princesses is still in print. This is the fact that the institution could not prevent, and it is the fact that gives Crawford's story whatever resolution it has. She published before the silence could reach her. The palace closed the doors in 1950 with the thoroughness of an institution that knows how to close doors. But it closed them after the words were already out, already in American hands, already being read by people who found in them an account of royal childhood that was more honest and more human than anything the official channels had ever produced. The palace could not unpublish the book. It could destroy Crawford's professional life and social world and financial stability. It could not reach the pages that were already in the world. Those pages contain something that no official portrait of Elizabeth II contains, and that no subsequent biography has quite replicated, because no subsequent biography was written by someone who was actually there every morning and every evening for 16 years. They contain Elizabeth at 6 years old, learning to read. At 10, absorbing the abdication with the controlled seriousness of a child, organizing herself around what her changed situation requires. At 13, frustrated to the point of controlled desperation by her inability to contribute anything concrete to a country that was fighting for its survival. At 19, driving a military vehicle in Camberley with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been asking for something real to do and has finally been permitted to do it. They contain Margaret performing in the Windsor pantomimes with the natural stagecraft of someone who had been holding rooms since before she could reliably walk. Margaret at 7, monitoring the emotional weather of the adults around her because monitoring it was the only form of control available to her. Margaret at 13, managing the permanent structural difficulty of being the second daughter in a family where second daughter was a constitutional category and not merely a birth order. These pages are what Crawford kept, not the grace and favor house, which was reclaimed, not the social world, which was closed, not the professional identity, which was dismantled, not the income, which dried up, not the connection with the women she had raised, which was severed in 1950 and maintained severed through the deaths of everyone involved. All of that was taken, methodically and completely, by an institution that was very good at taking things. What was not taken was the record she had made and sent out before the doors closed. Crawford understood this. She understood it in the way that practical people understand the one thing in a bad situation that remains theirs, not with triumph, not with the consolation of someone who has found a silver lining, but with the flat accuracy of someone taking stock of what actually remains. The book existed, the record of those children, seen from closer range than anyone outside the family had ever been permitted to see them, was in the world. The palace could frame it, could attach to it the Crawford label, and the warning, and the cautionary tale, but it could not unmake the thing itself. There is an irony in this story that the palace has never been required to confront, and that the rehabilitation of the 1990s and 2000s began to name without quite placing at the center where it belongs. In 1950, the palace punished Crawford for showing the royal family as human, for dissolving, with affection and good faith, the distance between the official portrait and the private reality, for writing about the inside of the institution from the inside and letting the outside see it. In 1969, the palace made the documentary Royal Family. It gave cameras access to the private life of the institution, to the family at Balmoral, in the kitchen, at the dinner table, in the ordinary domestic moments that the official portrait had always excluded. It did, with professional cameras and institutional control, precisely what Crawford had done with a pen in 1950. It showed the royal family as human. The difference was control. Crawford's version was hers. The palace's version was the palace's. The humanity in the documentary was permitted humanity, curated humanity, humanity that the institution had decided served its purposes and had therefore approved. Crawford's humanity was unauthorized. It was the institution's private life described from the inside by someone who was not the institution, and the institution had determined, in the logic it had always operated by, that unauthorized humanity was not humanity at all. It was a violation. Crawford could not have made this argument in 1950. The documentary did not exist yet. The comparison was not available. What she had was the fact of what she had done, and the fact of what was being done to her in response, and neither fact was, in the context of 1950, susceptible to the kind of examination that would have shown what they contained. The examination came later. It is still coming. Every biography, every documentary, every journalist who looks at the material of Crawford's life and writes about the gap between what she did and what was done to her is participating in the ongoing examination of something the palace has never been asked to answer for in any forum with consequences. There is no forum with consequences. This is the final thing Crawford's story demonstrates about the institution. The monarchy is not subject to the ordinary mechanisms of accountability. It cannot be sued. It cannot be voted out. It cannot be required to explain, in any binding way, what it did to Marion Crawford, or why, or to acknowledge that the punishment was what it was. It operates according to its own logic, with its own imperatives, and the people it damages have whatever recourse is available to them outside its walls, which in Crawford's case was a book, and in the retrospective case of the biographers and documentarians who came after her was a record, and in the case of this account is the telling of that record one more time. The telling matters, not because it changes anything that happened. The things that happened are fixed. Crawford is dead. Elizabeth is dead. Margaret is dead. The Queen Mother is dead. The silence ran its course, and ended not because it was broken, but because there was no one left to maintain it. The things that happened cannot be unmade. The telling matters because the things that happened contain a truth about what institutions do to people, and that truth is not specific to the royal family, or to the 1950s, or to the particular circumstances of Marion Crawford's service. The pattern is older and wider than any one instance of it. The trusted employee, given access and no contract. The assurance of care that is extended verbally and withheld in writing. The punishment that arrives when the trusted employee does something the institution considers a violation, calibrated not to the offense, but to the precedent. The framing of the punishment as deserved, maintained for as long as necessary by an institution with the power to maintain it. Crawford's name is attached to one version of this pattern. Other names are attached to other versions of it. The names accumulate. The pattern persists. The institutions that operate by this logic are not required to examine it, and they do not examine it, because the people within them are not bad people. They are people operating inside a structure that has its own imperatives, and the imperatives have always worked for the structure, and the structure does not investigate what works. What Crawford gave the world, against the institution's wishes and at the cost of everything the institution could cost her, was an honest account of two children who grew up to be remarkable women, in circumstances that Crawford managed with competence and love, and without sufficient acknowledgement from anyone. What the world gave Crawford, in exchange, was 38 years of silence, followed by a rehabilitation that arrived too late for her to know about. What Crawford kept, finally, was what she had always kept: the attention, the observation, the patient, precise, undeceived attentiveness to what was actually in front of her, rather than what she had been told to see. She had brought that quality to the children in 1932, and it had made her extraordinary at the work. She had brought it to the situation in 1950, and it had told her, accurately, that the institution was not going to forgive her. She had brought it to the Aberdeen years, and it had told her, with the same accuracy, that the silence was not going to lift. She did not pretend otherwise. She was honest, at the end as at the beginning, about what she saw. What she saw was that she had loved those children and done her best for them and been failed by the people and the institution she had served, and that the failure was real, and that the love was also real, and that the two things were both true and could not be made into one thing by any amount of processing. She held them both. She held them until the 11th of February, 1988, when she stopped holding anything. The book is still in print. The silence is over. The story is not.
Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.